Gaslighting, the art of distorting reality itself. What would happen if someone could make you doubt your own mind? Not by force or with threats, but by slowly and methodically rewriting your reality until you no longer trusted your own memories, your own thoughts, or even your own sanity. This is the dark power of gaslighting. The term comes from the 1944 psychological thriller film Gaslight, in which a man manipulates his wife into believing she is losing her mind. But gaslighting is not fiction. It happens every day in relationships, families, workplaces, and even politics. It is a psychological war in which the weapon is deception and the battlefield is your own perception is losing her mind. But gaslighting is not fiction. It happens every day in relationships, in families, in workplaces, and even in politics. It is a psychological war in which the weapon is deception and the battlefield is your own perception of truth. At first, it is subtle, an object out of place, a conversation that you are sure happened, but the other person swears it never did, a small inconsistency that you ignore, you question yourself, but move on. But then it intensifies. You start to hear things like, you are imagining things that I have never said, that you are exaggerating. Why are you always so paranoid? The manipulator rewrites past events, denies reality, and isolates you from other people who could reaffirm your version of the truth. Little by little, the ground crumbles at your feet, and you begin to doubt yourself. Maybe you really are exaggerating. Maybe your memory fails you. Maybe you are the problem. And once you start questioning your own reality, the manipulator has total control. But an even more insidious level is gaslighting by power. The master manipulator not only lies to you, but recruits others to reinforce the illusion. They will convince your friends, family, or coworkers that you are unstable, that you are dramatic, that you are the one who always causes problems. Now, when you seek validation, the people around you confirm the manipulator's version of reality. That is why gaslighting is so effective. It does not attack you head-on, but erodes your confidence from within. The longer it continues, the harder it is to escape, because now you do not even trust yourself. But gaslighting is just one of many psychological weapons, because what if someone not only manipulated your perception of reality, but reconfigures your mind so that you distort the truth? Now we move on to brainwashing, the complete dismantling of identity itself. Brainwashing, the complete dismantling of identity. What if someone could erase who you are, not just manipulate your thoughts, but completely rewrite them, strip you of your beliefs, values, identity, until you become someone completely different? This is the terrifying reality of brainwashing. Unlike gaslighting, which makes you doubt your own perception, brainwashing goes further. It dismantles your entire sense of self. It does not only distort reality, but replaces it. And the most disturbing thing is that most victims do not even realize what is happening. Brainwashing does not happen overnight. It is a carefully constructed process and psychological collapse designed to strip the individual of their independent thinking and implant new beliefs. The methods vary, but the pattern is always the same. Step 1. Break the mind. The first step is destabilization. The victim is subjected to isolation, exhaustion, confusion, and extreme stress. She is isolated from people, places, and sources of information that are familiar to her. Her sense of normalcy is shattered. Cult leaders separate recruits from their friends and family. Prisoners of war are subjected to sleep deprivation and relentless interrogation. Radical ideologies strip people of their old beliefs, making them feel lost and disoriented. Once the mind is weakened, it becomes fertile ground for new programming. Step 2. Install the new reality. Now the victim is bombarded with repetitions, emotional manipulation, and a strict control of stimuli and deprivation, RCT, a new set of rules. A new reality is imposed on them. They hear the same phrases over and over, repeated so often that, in the end, they stop questioning and start believing. Any doubt is punished, while obedience is rewarded. Little by little, the brain learns a simple rule. Resistance brings pain. Obedience brings relief. And then comes the final step, total control. The victim is isolated from external information, no longer trust their own thoughts, only what they are told. The manipulator becomes their only source of truth. At this point, they no longer only follow orders but believe them. Little by little, the old identity fades and is replaced by a new one. Step 3. The point of no return. Finally, the victim internalizes their new beliefs. They no longer need external control. They impose it on themselves. Brainwashing is complete at this stage. Even if they are released, even if the external pressure is removed, they may continue to defend their new identity. They may reject those who try to help them. They may believe that their past self was the lie and that their new self is the truth. That is why brainwashing is so dangerous. It is not just about controlling. It is about creating voluntary obedience. And once a person has been completely reprogrammed, they can defend their captor, manipulator, ideology at all costs. But what happens when someone not only accepts their new identity, but begins to actively love the person who trapped them in mind control? Now we enter into Stockholm Syndrome, a chilling paradox of loving your captor. Stockholm Syndrome, the chilling paradox of loving your captor. What would happen if the person who hurts you was the same person you have started protecting? That is the terrifying twist of Stockholm Syndrome, when a trapped, manipulated, and isolated victim begins to form a deep emotional bond with their abuser, and not only a bond of loyalty or dependence, but even love. It sounds impossible, but it happens more often than we want to believe. The term comes from a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1973, where the hostages defended their captors even after being released and refused to testify against them. Reportedly, one of them fell in love with one of the thieves. The public was stunned, but psychologists were not, because what seems like irrational behavior from the outside is, in reality, a psychological survival strategy. When someone is trapped without the possibility of escape, physically, emotionally, or mentally, the brain enters self-protection mode. You start looking for ways to feel safe. And if your only source of security is the same person who is hurting you, you adapt. Every small act of kindness from your aggressor, every time they forgive you, praise you, or offer you comfort, is amplified, takes on meaning, and little by little, your vision of them begins to change. You stop seeing a captor and start seeing someone who cares about you. Worse yet, you may start to see strangers, friends, family, people who are trying to help you, as threats that do not understand, that only want to separate you from them. The result is devastating. The victim not only stays, but defends the very person who has destroyed them. Stockholm Syndrome is not limited to physical captivity, but manifests in toxic relationships. Toxic relationships, sex, workplaces with a high level of control, and even emotionally manipulative families. Anywhere someone uses fear, control, and isolation to break a person and rebuild their loyalty. Once that loyalty takes root, the chain is complete. It is no longer necessary to hold you against your will because your will has been reshaped. But what if the next step is not loyalty? What if the manipulator does not want you to love him only to feel completely powerless without him? From twisted emotional bonds, we move on to learned helplessness, the silent surrender of the human spirit. What if someone could train you to surrender, not by chaining you, but by showing you again and again that whatever you do, nothing will change? That is the silent horror of learned helplessness. It starts little by little. You try to resist, you raise your voice, you fight, but every time you do, you are punished, ignored, or silenced. And in the end, something inside you stops trying, you stop hoping, believing that there's no way out. This psychological trap was first discovered in the 1960s through a brutal experiment. Some dogs were placed in a cage with an electrified floor. Some had a way to escape, others did not. Those who could not escape learned to withstand the shocks. But here is the scary thing. When they were later set free, they did not even try. They had learned that nothing they did mattered. So they lay down and accepted their fate. Human beings also do this in abusive relationships, oppressive work environments, controlling homes. When people are denied the ability to act for long enough, they stop looking for it and begin to think that maybe they deserve it, that maybe there is nothing better, that maybe fighting only makes things worse, and that the manipulator no longer has to resort to violence or threats. They have achieved something much more powerful: your resignation. What makes learned helplessness so cruel is that from the outside, it looks like apathy. People wonder why she does not leave or why he does not defend himself. But inside, the person feels that they have already tried, that they have already failed, and failing again is worse than doing nothing. It is not weakness. It is conditioning, a learned belief that change is impossible. And once someone reaches this point, it is easy to control, not because they cannot escape, but because they have been taught that it is not worth trying. But what if instead of making someone surrender, the goal is to make them cling to you to survive? From powerlessness, we move on to cultivating dependence, to making the manipulators make you feel as if they were your only lifeline. Cultivating dependence, the hidden trap of emotional control. What if someone made you believe that without him you would have nothing, no support, no security, no identity? What if he became the center of your world until the idea of losing him made you feel like you were losing yourself? This is the insidious power of cultivating dependence. Unlike learned helplessness, in which someone is conditioned to believe that they have no control, cultivating dependence is about making sure they do not even want to have it. The manipulator not only takes away your power, but convinces you that you never had it. At first, it seems that they take care of you. They offer you protection, guidance, support. They make you feel safe. They can tell you things like, "You do not need anyone else. I will always take care of you. The world is cruel, but I will protect you. I know what is best for you." And little by little, you stop making decisions for yourself. You start depending on them for approval, security, and your sense of self-esteem. They become your anchor. Then, the dynamic changes. Independence is discouraged. Making your own decisions is a threat to the relationship, and isolation begins. Friends and family are painted as enemies who do not care about you like I do. Doubt is sown. Are you sure you can handle this on your own? At some point, you stop questioning the idea of leaving. It seems impossible to you, not because you cannot, but because you do not know who you are without them, and that is the trap. Once dependence is complete, the manipulator no longer needs strength. You stay because leaving scares you more than the manipulation itself. In the end, the darkest psychological tricks are not the loudest, but the quietest, the ones that whisper that comfort that turns love into control. And when you realize what is happening, you're already trapped, but it is not the end. Awareness is the first step to escape. But what if instead of making you dependent, they made you addicted? What if they overwhelmed you with love and devotion only to snatch it away? Awareness is the first route of escape. But what if instead of making you dependent, they made you addicted? And what if they overwhelmed you with love and devotion only to snatch it away at the worst possible moment? From cultivating emotional dependence, we now move to love bombing, the euphoria that makes victims come back again and again. The love bombing, the euphoria that keeps victims hooked. What if the sweetest love you've felt was a trap? What if the affection, attention, and constant praise were not real, but the bait of a carefully prepared trap? This is the seductive power of love bombing. At first, it seems magical. The intensity is overwhelming in the best sense. They flood you with compliments, messages, gifts. They want to see you at all times. They tell you things like, "I have never felt this for anyone. You're everything I have always wanted. We are soulmates." It seems like a dream, but that's the point. It's not love, it's a strategy. Love bombing is not about connection, but about control. The goal is to quickly create an emotional dependence before you have the opportunity to see things clearly. It seems like passion, but in reality, it is a way to flood you emotionally. You become addicted to adrenaline, to dopamine, to validation, to attention, and just when you're completely hooked, everything suddenly changes. They walk away, they become cold and distant, they confuse you, you don't know what has happened, and you start chasing the version that you met at the beginning. And that is exactly what they want, because now you are vulnerable, you start trying harder to please them, you tolerate things that you would not have tolerated before, you blame yourself when they walk away, you cling to the hope that if you try a little harder, their true self will return, But that version was never real. It was a mask designed to attract you. And the cycle continues. Affection, rejection, affection again. Each return feels like a relief. Each disappearance feels like a punishment. You become addicted to the emotional roller coaster without realizing that you're being manipulated. Love bombing is not love. It is a chemical trap, a hook buried in kindness. And once you chase the euphoria, the manipulator knows that he can keep you close. But what happens when, just when you try to escape, they suddenly become kind again? Sweet, repentant, familiar. And just like that, you go back to square one. A kind word, a late-night message, an apology, and all the pain fades away, even if only for a moment. You want to believe that this time it is real, but the pattern repeats itself, and the cycle narrows, because love bombing ends with affection, ends with control. From emotion of love bombing, we now descend to hoovering, the final vacuum that draws you back in, the hoovering, the final vacuum that draws you back in. What if at the moment you finally escape, they come back, not angry, not cruel, but affectionate, repentant, familiar? That is the sinister beauty of hoovering, named after the vacuum cleaner for a reason. Because once you walk away, once you start rebuilding your life, they come back to suck you back in, and they know exactly what to say. I have changed. I miss you more than you know. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. You were the best thing that has ever happened to me. It sounds sincere, it seems real, but it's not about love. It's about regaining control. Hoovering doesn't happen when they're strong. It happens when they feel they're losing you at the moment you set boundaries, stop having contact, or find clarity. They panic because your independence threatens their dominance, so they use what worked before: sweetness, promises, nostalgia. They remind you of the good times. They tell you everything you wanted to hear during the worst, and it works because your mind is programmed to connect, even after the pain. Your heart wants to believe that maybe this time it will be different, that maybe they mean it. But here is the truth. If the change only comes when you leave, it is not a change, it is bait. And once they attract you again, the cycle resumes slowly, silently. The heat fades, the old patterns return, and now they know that it is even more difficult for you to walk away, because this time you chose to return. Hoovering is not a second chance. It is the reset button of manipulation, but not all control is so obvious. Some of the darkest psychological tricks do not seem like manipulation at all. They seem like guilt, sacrifice, as if you were the one who is always wrong. And that is what makes them so effective. Not all manipulators use force. Some use your kindness, your conscience, your desire to be good. They turn your empathy into chains, and before you realize it, you are apologizing for being hurt. The game changes, but the goal remains the same: to keep you under control without ever looking like the villain. From the emotional trap, we now move on to guilt, the silent weapon that turns your conscience against you. Guilt, the silent weapon that turns your conscience against you. What if the more you cared, the easier it was to control you? What if your own compassion could be used as a leash that tightens every time you try to defend yourself for yourself? That is the silent devastation of making you feel guilty. Unlike screams or threats, this tactic whispers. It doesn't say obey. It says, how could you? And the moment you start questioning your boundaries, the trap starts to close. You express a need, and after everything they have done for you, you try to set a boundary, and they sigh. I guess I don't matter to you anymore. You walk away, and they remind you of their sacrifices, their pain, their love, and you feel that pang in your chest, that pressure in your throat, that silent, twisted feeling that maybe you are being selfish, but you are not. You are being manipulated. Guilt works because it doesn't attack your logic. It attacks your heart. It uses your sense of justice, your empathy. You need to be a good person. The manipulator does not have to prove that you did something wrong. He only has to make you feel that you did. At the moment you start to doubt yourself, you stop resisting, you apologize for things that are not your fault, you back down to avoid hurting them, you give a not because you agree, but because the guilt is unbearable, and that is the trick. They don't need to take control because you give it to them. Guilt becomes a necklace, soft, invisible, strong, and the more you care, the tighter it gets. What makes it so destructive is that you don't even realize you are being controlled. You think you're being kind, compassionate, reasonable, but kindness without limits is not love. It is surrender, and making you feel guilty feeds on that surrender, feeding on your doubt, until saying no feels like cruelty, and saying yes feels like survival. But guilt alone doesn't always work. Sometimes they combine it with something stronger, the fear of losing everything. And from the weight of conscience, we move on to emotional blackmail, the threat that turns love into a tool of power. What if love came with conditions, not with promises or commitments, but with subtle, silent, and suffocating threats of the type, if you don't do this, I'll leave, I'll hurt myself, I'll ruin everything. This is emotional blackmail, where love is not a bond, but a bargaining chip. It doesn't always seem dramatic. It's not always screams or ultimatums. Sometimes it sounds calm, almost kind, but the message is always the same. You are responsible for my happiness, for my pain, for my reactions. Say no, and they threaten to withdraw, to show their disagreement, and suddenly victim. Set a boundary, and they make you feel like you are destroying them. And it works because it hits your deepest fear, the fear of abandonment, of not being loved, of being seen as cruel. So you apply it, not because it seems right to you, but because you are afraid of what will happen if you don't. This tactic plays with your sense of duty, your desire to avoid conflict, your longing to protect others. But the truth is that you're not protecting them. You're protecting the version of them that they use to control you, and over time, that erodes you. You start living to get their approval, walking on eggshells, calculating every word, sacrificing your own needs just to maintain peace. But peace built on emotional threats is not peace. It is silent submission, and like all subtle manipulations, you do not realize the cost until it is too late, until you look back and see how much of yourself you have given up. Because emotional blackmail not only takes away your freedom, it convinces you that love demands it. And once you believe it, you start to measure your worth by how much you can endure. You stop asking yourself if it is fair, and you start asking yourself how to prevent them from leaving. But true love does not come with threats. It does not make you shrink, bend, or disappear. It is not your job to be the emotional lifeguard of someone who keeps starting fires. Emotional blackmail does not build connections. It builds cages, and the longer you stay in them, the harder it is to see the bars. But what if the manipulation attacks not your decisions, but your sense of security? Love becomes a control tool, and we enter the terrain of fear, manipulating minds through fabricated terror. What if someone made you believe that the world is always on the verge of collapse unless you follow their example? Fear is one of the most powerful tools of manipulation, and when it is carefully crafted, exaggerated, or turned into a weapon, it transforms into something completely different. Alarmism, unlike genuine warnings meant to protect, is designed for control. It floods your mind with the worst scenarios, exaggerated threats, and constant reminders of danger, not to keep you safe, but to keep you compliant. You hear that if you leave, you will regret it forever. No one else will love you. The world out there is worse than what they have done. It can come from a partner, a father, a leader of a sect, or even an entire political system. Alarmism creates a fortress of terror so overwhelming and convincing that the manipulator seems the only safe place. And once fear sets in, it restructures your decision-making. You no longer ask yourself if this is right. You ask yourself what will happen if everything goes wrong. The mind becomes cautious, the heart hesitant, and the manipulator becomes stronger because fear shrinks your world until only they remain. The irony is that the threat is not usually real, or if it is magnified to distortion. You are not reacting to reality. You are reacting to a story that they have carefully planted in your mind, and over time, it not only affects your decisions, but becomes your worldview. You stop trusting your instincts. You doubt every opportunity, every connection, every possible escape. Fear becomes a lens through which everything seems dangerous, risky, hostile, and, in that state, the manipulator becomes the only certainty left. You stop moving forward, not because you are trapped, but because you have been taught to fear what is beyond the walls. That is the true power of alarmism. It does not hold you with chains. It convinces you that the chains are protection, and when fear becomes comfort, You have already surrendered. But sometimes they don't need to make you feel afraid of the world. Sometimes they just make you feel like you owe them everything. From fear as a leash, we move on to creating a sense of obligation. The debt that is never really paid, creating a sense of obligation. The debt that is never really paid. What if every favor came with invisible conditions? Every act of kindness, every gift, every opportunity, secretly tracked, silently recorded, waiting to be collected later. This is the dark side of creating a sense of obligation, a psychological trick that turns generosity into influence and gratitude into guilt. It often starts with something useful. A mentor gives you your first big opportunity, a boss goes out of their way to defend you, a partner supports you in a difficult time, and in those moments, it seems sincere, but then the reminders come. After everything I've done for you, you wouldn't be here if it weren't for me. I thought you were the kind of person who appreciated loyalty. What once seemed like generosity now seems like a contract that you have never accepted, but that you are expected to fulfill forever. This tactic is especially common in toxic work environments, exploitative families, and manipulative friendships. A boss can make an exception for you and then expect you to remain silent when something unethical occurs. A friend can offer you unconditional support and then use it against you when you assert yourself. A father can remind you over and over how much he sacrificed so that you could have a better life. So you must obey. Simple gratitude becomes a moral burden. You feel that saying no is a betrayal, that setting boundaries is selfish. You start doing things not because you want to, but because you fear being considered ungrateful, and the debt is never paid. No matter how much you give back, it is never enough because it is not about balance but about influence. The goal is not to remind you of the past, but to control your future, and that is how obligation becomes a trap. It is not about kindness. It is about control disguised as generosity, and once you believe you owe someone something unpayable, you stop asking yourself what is fair and start asking yourself what you can do to stay on their good side. In that state, your choices are no longer really yours. You're no longer guided by values, you're guided by guilt, and guilt, when manipulated, becomes a leash that you put on yourself. But manipulation does not always manifest itself through guilt. Sometimes it starts by eroding your confidence enough to make you question whether you deserve to say no. From emotional debt, we now move on to the seeds of doubt. The silent sowing of uncertainty that becomes surrender. The seeds of doubt. The silent sowing of uncertainty that becomes surrender. What if someone did not try to control you directly, but simply made you question yourself until you handed over control? That is the subtle and devastating effect of sowing doubt. It is not a loud accusation. It is a pattern, a soft background murmur that makes you doubt your instincts, your abilities, even your worth. It may sound like, "Are you sure it's the best decision? I didn't expect you to understand the whole picture. I'm just trying to help you." You tend to exaggerate, and it happens everywhere. In corporate environments, a manager may repeatedly dismiss your opinion only to praise it later when someone else says the same thing. In academia, a student may be told that their ideas lack depth, no matter how solid they are, until they stop expressing themselves completely. In friendships, someone may casually compare you to other people who are doing more with their lives, always leaving you feeling one step behind. It is not blatant sabotage. It is erosion, a slow weakening of your confidence until you stop trusting yourself. And once that confidence is lost, you become easier to direct, easier to silence, easier to keep in your place, because what is the point of speaking if you are probably wrong? Why try if you're just going to screw it up? This is how powerful people keep others small, not by force, but by suggestion. They don't need to tell you that you are incapable. They just need you to start wondering. And that is the tragedy of doubt. It doesn't have to be true to seem real. Once the seed is planted, you water it yourself. You start to censor your voice. You seek approval before making decisions. You shrink in rooms where before you stood upright. It is not only confidence that is lost, it is identity. And when you forget who you are, you follow anyone who acts as if they know more than you. But what if that uncertainty not only clouded your present, but extended into your past? What if someone could rewrite your memories until you no longer knew what is real and what is not from doubt? And at that moment, we move on to the manipulation of memory. the theft of your own history, the manipulation of memory, the theft of your own history. What if someone could change your past? Not the events themselves, but how you remember them. This is the silent crime of memory manipulation. When someone not only manipulates your present, but goes into your memories and reshapes them so that you not only question what is happening now, but everything that has happened. It is more common than we think. A boss minimizes the success of a project you have led, saying that we all know that you have needed a lot of help. A father insists that you have always been a difficult child, although you remember things very differently. A manipulative partner reminds you of fights and failures that you do not seem to remember, conveniently revised to turn you into the villain over time. This not only causes confusion, it fractures reality. You start to wonder if it really was that bad, if you were exaggerating, if maybe you have just forgotten the details because memory is not a perfect record. It is fragile, emotional, reconstructed every time we revisit it, and the manipulators know it. They don't have to erase the truth, just undoing it little by little until it is unrecognizable. Once your memories fade, so does your sense of self. You cannot defend your past, you cannot explain your decisions, you cannot be sure of what is real, and when you cannot trust your own mind, you look for someone else to explain it to you, and that is exactly what they want. This is what makes memory manipulation so dangerous. It turns your own mind into an unknown territory. Not only do you feel insecure, you feel lost, and the more you question your past, the easier it is for someone else to define your present, because if they can rewrite your history, they can control where it takes you. But sometimes it is not necessary to rewrite the past to destroy someone. Sometimes it is enough to point to what is already fragile, twisting the memories. Now we move on to exploiting insecurities. When manipulators use the cracks in your confidence as a weapon, exploiting insecurities and turning doubt into control. What if someone didn't have to invent your weaknesses, but simply detect them and use them? That is the silent cruelty of exploiting. The manipulator does not need to break you. He just has to find the parts of you that you are no longer sure of and press them. Insecurities are personal, private, often hidden, but once someone finds them, your fear of not being good enough, smart enough, or attractive becomes a tool, not to support you, but to control you. It manifests everywhere. A boss highlights your lack of credentials, not to help you improve, but to prevent you from asking for a raise. Your partner jokes about your appearance and then says, "I'm just being honest. I'm just being honest. Don't be so sensitive." A friend makes fun of your insecurities in front of others, making it look like a joke, but always touching a point that is too sensitive. They're not just comments. They are reminders that you are imperfect, fragile, and lucky to have their approval. And if you start to rebel, they will tell you that you are too sensitive, that I'm only trying to help you, that you are thinking too much, and little by little, you start to believe them, you stop asking for more, you stop defending yourself, and you start to think that maybe they are right, that maybe I'm too much or I'm not enough. That is the trap. The more they feed you with doubts, the more power they gain, because insecurity reduces your voice, your confidence, your expectations, and when you lower your expectations, they never have to rise to meet them. Exploiting insecurities does not require strength. It only requires attention to what you already fear and the willingness to use it against you again and again. And once you start defining yourself by your flaws, you become easier to mold, easier to handle, easier to control. But not all manipulation is about destroying you. Sometimes it seems that they understand you, that they are a reflection of you, that they become everything you want to be until you trust them without questioning anything. From exposed weakness, we move on to the exploitation of mirror neurons. How manipulators use imitation to gain your trust, how imitation generates trust. What if someone didn't convince you with words, but with reflections? What if, without realizing it, you started to trust someone simply because they act like you? That is the hidden influence of the exploitation of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are the part of your brain that lights up when you see someone smile, yawn, cry, or recoil. That's why we cringe when someone hits their toe, or we get tense during a movie scene. They're designed for empathy, but they can be used to control, because when someone subtly imitates your gestures, your posture, your speech patterns, or your expressions, Your brain begins to interpret them as something familiar, safe, like you, and when something seems familiar to you, you let your guard down. In a job interview, an expert manipulator imitates your tone and body language, making you feel an instant connection. In sales, a representative subtly repeats your phrases and nods as you speak, making you feel understood, even if they are not listening to you at all. In dating, someone adopts your interests, your habits, even your insecurities, not out of genuine compatibility, but as a tactic to gain your trust. And it works. You start to feel close to them. You open up, you become receptive, but the connection is not real. It is a reflection. This is not always malicious. We all imitate people we like, but when it is done intentionally in a calculated and rehearsed way, it becomes manipulation, not by overcoming your defenses, but by covertly circumventing them. The trick is not in what they say. It is how they silently teach your brain that they are like you. And there is the danger. You do not question someone who understands you. You do not protect yourself from someone who seems like a mirror, but trust based on imitation is not trust. It is programming. And when you realize that they were only reflecting you, they already know exactly how to use what they have learned. Because once they have gained your trust through imitation, they can reach more deeply into your compassion. But what if they didn't just imitate your behavior? What if they used your kindness? What if they went beyond your logic, your defenses, and went directly to the part of you that wants to help, forgive, understand? From the illusion of equality, we move on to the exploitation of empathy, to how manipulators turn your compassion into a weapon against you, exploiting empathy when compassion becomes a weapon. What if your greatest strength, your ability to care about others, became what is used to control you? That is the devastating tactic that lies behind the exploitation of empathy. It does not involve threats, lies, or even persuasion. It works because you are human, because you feel that empathy is the glue of human relationships. It is what allows us to relate to pain, to reach out to support each other. But when someone recognizes your empathy as a tool not to heal, but to manipulate, they can bend it to their will. They tell you their sad story, show you their scars, confess their trauma, just when you start to walk away, and suddenly you feel responsible. A coworker breaks down emotionally just when you are about to report their misconduct. A manipulative parent reminds you of their sacrifices every time you question their behavior. A partner makes you feel that setting a boundary is abandoning someone who has already been through too much, and because you're kind, you stay, you bend, you compromise, you make space, not because it is fair, but because you would feel guilty, not too much. But that guilt is not born from your actions, but has been carefully planted intentionally. Empathy is meant to connect us, not chain us. But in the wrong hands, it becomes a trap in which you lock yourself. The most skilled manipulators do not deny their flaws, but present them as reasons why you should forgive more, strive more, give one more chance. You become the caretaker of their pain, the custodian of their damage, and, little by little, you lose the space to attend to your own. That is how empathy becomes captivity. You confuse someone's wounds with their intentions. You confuse suffering with sincerity, but pain does not justify manipulation, and compassion does not mean conformity. Because if someone uses their fragility to break you, then empathy becomes captivity. You confuse someone's wounds with their intentions. You confuse suffering with sincerity, but pain does not justify manipulation, and compassion does not mean conformity. Because if someone uses their brokenness to break you, what they need is not your help, it is your distance. But not all manipulation makes you feel guilty. Some make you feel free, empowered, as if you were in command when in reality you never have been. From compassion as a weapon, we move on to the illusion of choice, when free will becomes another performance. The illusion of choice, when free will is just a performance. What if all the decisions you make were already predetermined, pushed, or pigeonholed without you realizing it? What if your feeling of control was just that? A feeling and not reality. This is the disturbing trick of the illusion of choice, a manipulation so subtle that it does not eliminate your options, it simply shapes them. At first glance, you feel empowered, They tell you that the decision is yours. They offer you multiple paths, different flavors, varied strategies, but what they don't tell you is that all paths lead to the same destination, the one they wanted from the beginning. A company offers 3 price levels knowing that most people will choose the intermediate one, not because it is the best, but because it has been designed to appear so. A manipulative leader offers a group the opportunity to vote on a decision, but only after influencing the context, the language, and the available options. A toxic couple tells you to do what you want after subtly making you feel that any option other than one will cause you pain. You feel like you are choosing, but you are not. You are being carefully directed invisibly. This trick works because people resist control, but crave autonomy. So instead of pushing you to make a decision, manipulators present you with a menu knowing perfectly well what you're going to choose, and the more you feel that it has been your idea, the less likely you are to question it. You are responsible for the result. You take the blame, and they retain the power without ever having to exercise it. That is why the illusion is so powerful. It protects the manipulator by making you feel like the author of your own story. But choice without truth is not freedom. It is choreography. And once you realize that the path was designed for you, you begin to wonder how many of your choices were never really yours. But what if they not only guided you, but used you as a pawn in someone else's game? Someone else's game? What if someone manipulated not only your decisions, but also your relationships based on a false autonomy? We move on to triangulation when control is obtained by pitting people against each other. Triangulation, in which control comes from chaos. What if someone didn't confront you directly, but used other people to control you? What if all conversations, all conflicts, all decisions went through a third party who carefully controlled or selected them? This is the manipulative art of triangulation, a tactic in which the manipulator not only influences you, but influences your reality by involving others, not to solve problems, but to stir them up. It often starts subtly, casually mentioning that someone thinks you're difficult or how some people have been worried about you lately. They tell you what someone has said, never directly, never with proof, just enough to sow doubt, and soon you begin to doubt who to trust, including yourself. Triangulation thrives in offices, where leaders pit employees against each other to maintain control. It appears in friendships, where one person subtly pits 2 others against each other to stay in the center. It is common in family dynamics when a parent turns siblings into rivals for attention or approval. And in relationships, it can be as simple and destructive as invoking an ex to create jealousy, insecurity, or submission. What makes triangulation so dangerous is that it not only isolates you, but erodes your sense of unity with others. You stop communicating directly. You rely on filtered information. You see people as threats instead of allies. And while everyone else is entangled in confusion, the manipulator sits on top, controlling the flow, fueling the fire and watching trust collapse. That is the power of triangulation. It not only divides people, but ensures that no one else is close enough to challenge the one who pulls the strings. And when the connection breaks, so does the resistance, because people who do not trust each other do not unite against the one who controls them all. But triangulation is just the beginning. What if breaking ties was not just a tool, but the whole strategy? Next, we move on to the tactics of divide and conquer, how isolation becomes the basis of domination. Tactics of divide and conquer, how isolation becomes a weapon. What if the easiest way to control people was not through fear or force, but by keeping them divided? What if you could maintain power simply by making sure that the people below you never unite? This is the ruthless logic behind the tactics of divide and conquer, a method as old as empires and still used today in homes, workplaces, politics, and social movements. It's simple. You break the ties so you can reinforce your control. A manipulative boss has favorites, which leads to silent competition instead of collaboration. A sectarian leader demands loyalty by encouraging his followers to denounce each other. A couple isolates you from your friends and family, not with orders, but with doubts because they don't really care about you like I do. In politics, entire populations are divided into hostile sides, too distracted from each other to see who is really pulling the strings. When people are disconnected, they are easier to manage. There is no coordinated resistance. no shared truth, no trust, only silos of suspicion, and the manipulator remains above all, the only common point of contact, the only voice that everyone hears. If you're angry, you talk to them. If you're afraid, you go to them. You stop looking for others and start looking up. But the most dangerous thing is how natural it can seem. They don't have to say don't trust them. They just sow small, constant messages. I wouldn't tell them everything. Be careful. There are people who are jealous of you. I've heard that they have been saying things about you, and you believe it. You isolate yourself, and in your isolation, their power grows. This is how division becomes control. Not by force, but by design. Because when you break the connection, you break the resistance. And when no one unites, the one who caused the fracture rises higher. But what happens when that power shift occurs in public, where everyone can see you fall? And that is the goal. To move from private isolation to public humiliation, the spectacle that imposes obedience through humiliation. Public humiliation, when humiliation becomes a tool of control. What if your silence could be bought? Not with money or threats, but with humiliation. What if the fear of being ashamed in front of others was enough to keep you at bay forever? This is the calculated cruelty of public humiliation, a manipulation tactic that not only aims to punish, but also to exhibit. It is not about a private correction. It is about making you an example. In essence, public humiliation is designed to send a message. If you step out of line, this could happen to you. It uses shame as a weapon, turns everyone against you, and is incredibly effective, not only because it hurts, but because it endures in a toxic work environment. A manager represses you in a meeting, not to solve problems, but to affirm their dominance. At school, a teacher ridicules a student's mistake before classmates, not to teach, but to keep their power. On social networks, a single mistake is brought up, not to correct behavior, but to feed anger and control the narrative. Shame is a psychological burn, and the human brain is programmed to avoid it at all costs. That's why this tactic works well. It doesn't need repeating. Once is enough. And the aftereffects are just as damaging. You shrink, you avoid risk, you stay away from others for fear of being seen. You feel bad not because you have done something wrong, but because you've been pointed out and now everyone else sees what happens to those who dare to speak. That domino effect is the real objective. It is not just about controlling you, but about controlling those who observe you and the communities, the organizations, and the online spaces. This creates a paralyzing effect. No one dares to dissent. No one steps out of line because once shame becomes policy, compliance becomes survival. That is the lasting wound of public humiliation. It doesn't end when the room goes silent. It resonates in how you speak, how you move, how you think. It becomes a ghost that haunts your personal expression, and those who observe learn the lesson without anyone having to teach it to them. They silence themselves. But what if shame isn't enough? What if the manipulator needs a scapegoat, a target to blame, to exile in order to protect their power at any price, at the cost of the spectacle of humiliation? We move from public humiliation to the ancestral manipulation that survives by sacrificing another person, turning them into a scapegoat, surviving at the cost of another sacrifice. The ancient manipulation that survives by sacrificing another person, the guilt of others, surviving by sacrificing another person. What if someone could erase their own guilt by giving it to you? What if every failure, every mistake, every uncomfortable truth could be buried by blaming the nearest target? This is the dark ritual of the guilt of others. It is not just about assigning blame. It is about preserving the illusion of purity, order, or leadership by choosing someone to bear the weight of everyone's discomfort. And once that person is chosen, the truth ceases to matter. What matters is that the rest of the group feels clean. The term comes from ancient rituals in which a goat, yes, a real goat, was symbolically loaded with the sins of a community and then led into the desert. An animal exiled to save the tribe. The modern version is no less brutal, just more sophisticated. In families, a child becomes the problem, absorbing the dysfunction of the entire home. In workplaces, an employee is blamed for the failure of a project, even if the real problem was poor leadership or planning. In society, entire groups are labeled as threats to distract attention from deeper systemic failures. The scapegoat becomes a magnet for resentment, fear, and anger, not because they deserve it, but because it is convenient and because the group wants relief more than justice. No one stops to wonder if the accusations make sense, but here is the musica cruist brows a collective decision to look the other way, and if the scapegoat resists, that is used as more proof. Look how defensive they are if they collapse. Look how unstable they are. It is a no-win trap, because when you're chosen to carry, that everything you do is reinterpreted as proof that you deserve the weight. That is what makes the scapegoat so sinister. It protects the guilty by destroying the innocent. It cleanses the group not with the truth, but with sacrifice. And while someone else suffers in your place, you feel safe, but that safety is a lie, because the next time power needs protection, anyone could be the scapegoat. But what if the manipulator did not assign blame to a single person? What if he could make everyone believe that the safest thing is simply to follow the crowd? From chosen targets to collective pressure, we now move on to the exploitation of social proof. How conformity becomes control. The exploitation of social proof. When conformity becomes control. What if the easiest way to control someone was not to threaten them, but to show them that everyone else agrees? What if the fear of standing out was stronger than the desire to be right? This is the silent force behind the exploitation of social proof, a tactic in which manipulators do not pressure you directly, but let you see the crowd and let the crowd do the rest. Human beings are programmed to survive, and for most of history, surviving meant belonging to the group. So when we're insecure, we look at others, we think that if everyone else believes it, it must be true, that if no one objects, I probably shouldn't either, that if I say something, I might look like the crazy one. And manipulators know this, so they create the illusion of consensus to keep you quiet, obedient, and in line. In organizations, they fill meetings with loyal voices, so that consensus seems chaotic. In cults, they surround recruits with enthusiastic members to pressure them to join immediately. In politics and the media, they flood social networks with repeated slogans and carefully selected popular opinions until you start to wonder if resistance is even possible. This works even when the group is not real. A few loud voices can seem like many, and a handful of prepared questions can make that everyone else doubts their answers. And a manipulator only needs you to doubt, to stop long enough to keep up with the rest. And once you feel like you're the only one who sees the cracks, you start to doubt your own judgment. Am I thinking too much? Maybe I'm being difficult. They can't be wrong, can they? That moment of uncertainty is the opportunity they need, because social proof does not make something right. It just makes it easier to accept. And once you follow the crowd, you become the proof for someone else. That is the danger of social proof. It is self-sufficient. It requires no orders, only suggestions, and in a short time people impose the rules, not because they believe them, but because they see that everyone else has already done so. But sometimes conformity is not only encouraged, it is demanded, not through suggestions, but through silence, fear, and the forced agreement of an implicit consensus. Now we enter into groupthink induction, how individual minds are erased within the collective. Groupthink induction, when individual minds are erased by the collective. What if expressing your opinion was not only discouraged, but silently punished? What if the price of disagreement was exile, ridicule, or being labeled as the problem until eventually everyone stopped thinking aloud? This is the chilling result of succumbing to groupthink, a psychological manipulation in which conformity is not only expected, but imposed in a group infected by groupthink. Harmony matters more than truth. Agreement becomes a survival instinct. It is not about believing. It is about not rocking the boat. In a workplace, nobody questions the direction of a failed project because expressing doubts means being seen as negative or disloyal. In government circles, bad policies are approved without opposition because nobody wants to be the one who does not understand it. In communities, harmful behaviors are normalized because pointing them out means becoming an outcast. The group does not say, "You must agree." It simply rewards silence, punishes questions, and treats any rejection as a betrayal. So people adapt, shrink, imitate the dominant tone, self-censor, not because they have changed their minds, but because it is safer to disappear into the crowd, and the more this happens, the more the illusion of unity grows. We all think that nobody here disagrees, that this is how we do things, but behind that surface harmony is a group of individuals who have stopped talking, questioning, and thinking. What remains is not agreement, but silence, and the worst part is that groupthink not only erases dissent, it makes it unthinkable. Not only do you avoid saying the wrong thing, you stop believing it. That is the true cost of groupthink. It not only represses the individual, it reprograms them. And once the group speaks with one voice, there is no room for nuances, nor space for change, only obedience disguised as unity. But what if someone not only erases your voice, but completely rewrites your identity? What if they make you believe that you're something completely different, so that you never question the role created for you? From collective silence, we now move on to cultivating a false identity. As manipulators reshape who you are to keep you where they want, cultivating a false identity when they train to turn you into who they need. What if the person you thought you were is not really you? What if little by little someone else had shaped your self-image until it no longer reflected your truth, but served their control? This is the slow and suffocating manipulation of cultivating a false identity. It does not start with force, it starts with feedback. You are always the peacemaker, you are too emotional to lead. You are the responsible one. We count on you to keep everything in order. You're not the type to question authority. And when they're repeated over time, these messages become mirrors. You start to see yourself through their eyes. You adapt. You accommodate. Not because it is who you are, but because it is who they say you are. This tactic is everywhere. In toxic families, a child becomes the failure, another the golden child, labels that follow them into adulthood, even if they were never true. In controlling relationships, they tell you who you are with them and warn you that outside the relationship you would collapse. In cults, the group eliminates individuality and assigns new roles, new names, new values, until your identity belongs to the collective. The danger is that this false identity often feels deserved. It is reinforced with praise, attention, belonging. You are rewarded for staying in character, and you're punished, subtly or not, every time you step out of it. So you learn to play the role, you internalize it, and over time, you forget that it was once a role. You stop asking yourself what you want, what you believe in, who you really are, because those questions are uncomfortable, even dangerous, and comfort, even if it is false, is easier to maintain than the truth. That is what makes this tactic so disturbing. They do not lock you in a cage. They give you a disguise and applaud you for wearing it. And when you realize that it does not fit you well, you have already built your life around it. But nobody should live as someone else's idea of who they should be. And yet, even if you start to question that false identity, your mind may not let you out so easily, because then comes the internal trap, the cognitive dissonance, the tension between truth and belief that keeps you tied to the lie, the cognitive dissonance, the mental tug-of-war that keeps you tied. What if the person who is keeping you trapped was you? Not out of weakness or ignorance, but because your mind is trying to protect you from a truth too painful to accept. This is the silent torment of cognitive dissonance, a psychological state in which two contradictory beliefs coexist in your mind at the same time, creating a tension so uncomfortable that your brain strives to resolve it, not by facing the truth, but by misrepresenting it. Suppose you believe you're a good judge of character, but someone you love hurts you again and again. Now you are faced with a choice. Either you are wrong about that person, or you convince yourself that the damage was not that serious. For many, the second option is easier, less painful, because if you were wrong about them, what else could you be wrong about? What does that say about you? So you justify, you explain the abuse, the manipulation, the control. You tell yourself that it was not their intention, that it is my fault, that I have pressured them too much, that they are going through a bad time. And with each excuse, the tension decreases, but the lie grows, because now your beliefs protect your comfort, not your clarity. You do not see the world as it is. You see it in a way that allows you to survive. Cognitive dissonance not only keeps you trapped in relationships, it also manifests itself in the workplace. Loyalty to toxic bosses in ideological bubbles, in systems where people support behaviors that contradict their values because facing the truth would mean questioning their entire identity. And the more time passes, the harder it is to break, not because you do not know the truth deep down, but because accepting it would reveal too much. That is the power of cognitive dissonance. It does not imprison you physically, but mentally it forces you to rewrite your story to protect your belief in yourself, in others, and in the world. And that rewriting becomes the chain, because as long as your comfort depends on the lie, you will fight to preserve it no matter what it costs. But what if your beliefs were not the only thing that was distorted? What if emotions themselves, panic, joy, outrage, were used to infect not only one person, but entire groups at once? From internal conflict, we move on to emotional contagion, to the exploitation of emotions, to how mood becomes large-scale manipulation, to emotional contagion, to exploitation when manipulators infect the room. What if someone can make you feel what they want, not by convincing you, but by making you absorb their emotion? What if fear, anger, excitement, or even guilt could spread like a virus until they were not just their feelings, but yours too? This is the subtle and powerful force behind the exploitation of emotional contagion. In essence, emotional contagion is a natural human instinct. We reflect emotions to connect with others. When someone laughs, we smile. When someone cries, we soften. It is empathy and connection, but in the wrong hands, that same instinct becomes a weapon. Manipulators do not need to argue, persuade, or even explain. They only show the emotion they want you to feel out loud, with intensity and consistently, until you too begin to feel it. A political speaker feeds the crowd with rage and fear, and soon everyone screams, not because they agree, but because they are swept away by the energy. A toxic coworker bursts into a room, tense and irritated, and, in a matter of minutes, everyone feels like they are walking on eggshells. A cult leader cries in front of his followers while telling an invented story of victimhood, and the group cries with him, not for the truth, but for the performance. And this is what makes it work. You do not realize what is happening because emotions bypass logic. They're transmitted through tone, body language, volume, and rhythm, and they spread faster than facts. Once the room is infected, resistance collapses. You nod even if you do not agree. You remain silent because it does not seem like the right time. You follow the energy because standing still seems unnatural. The manipulator does not need your loyalty. He only needs your compliance. And once he has it, he has momentum. Crowds become mobs. Support becomes hysteria. A lie becomes a movement. Not because it makes sense, but because it feels good at that moment. And there's the true danger of emotional contagion. It makes you believe that the feeling is yours, and once that line blurs, the manipulator no longer needs to control your thoughts. Your emotions will do it for him. Because in a room where feelings dominate, the strongest mood becomes the law. But what if they could make that mood seem even more real by making it seem like it is everywhere? Next, we enter the term moth phenomenon, showing how repetition makes manipulation seem like reality. The term moth phenomenon, where repetition seems like truth. What if simply hearing something over and over made you believe it? Not because it was true, but because it suddenly seemed to be everywhere. This is the strange power of the batter moth phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion, a psychological peculiarity whereby, once your brain is exposed to something, it begins to constantly notice it, and once you notice it everywhere, you start to assume it must be important, common, or real. It starts innocently. You learn a new word, and suddenly, it's in every article, every conversation, every headline. You hear about a car model, and now it's parked on every street. Nothing has changed. You just started paying attention. But this harmless brain glitch becomes dangerous when manipulators intentionally activate it. They don't need to prove anything, just make you notice it repeatedly. A political campaign repeats the same phrases in every channel, in every ad, in every post, until even skeptics can quote them from memory. A conspiracy theory is repeated in marginal podcasts, YouTube comments, and casual conversations so often that it begins to seem legitimate. A brand appears on your social networks, podcasts, and recommended videos until you are convinced that it is the most popular option, and once your brain labels it and your ideas repeat it frequently, it begins to treat it as valid. You don't even have to believe it completely. You simply stop questioning it. This is how disinformation spreads, how biased ideas gain strength. Not because they are persuasive, but because they are persistent. Your brain confuses frequency with importance, familiarity with truth, and that's all the manipulator needs. Not agreement, just weariness, because the more you see it, the less you care, and in the end, you start saying what everyone else says, not because it's right, but because it sounds louder than your own thoughts. That's the trap of BMOF. It hijacks your attention and then tricks you into trusting it. The lie does not need to be hidden. It just needs to become normal, because when something appears everywhere, it stops looking suspicious and starts looking inevitable. But what if they could do more than just repeat an idea? What if they could anchor it deep in your mind so that every decision you made afterwards was subtly shaped by it? From repetition to reinforcement, we now enter the anchor effect. How your first impression can control all that follows. The anchor effect, when first impressions set a trap. What if your first information was not a starting point, but a trap? What if all the decisions you make afterwards, all the judgments, all the beliefs, were subtly shaped by that first anchor? This is the psychological pull of the anchor effect, a cognitive bias whereby the first thing we see or hear becomes the point of reference for everything that follows, even if it is arbitrary, even if it is misleading. Once the anchor is dropped, your mind adjusts to it. The manipulators know it. They don't try to force your decision. They just control the first number, the first image, the first idea, and from there you will do the work of rationalizing everything else. A salesperson starts with an outrageously high price, and when they lower it, you feel like you're getting a bargain, even though the final price is still inflated. A media outlet opens with a sensational headline, and by the time you read the full story, your emotions have already been shaped. A manipulative partner frames a situation in such a way that you are likely to overreact, and suddenly your response seems extreme, however calm it may be. Anchors are not always numbers. They can be ideas, phrases, images, even tones of voice, and once the anchor is in place, your mind starts to adjust everything around it. You don't judge a situation on its own merits. You compare it to the anchor. Well, at least it's not as bad as what he did last time. At least this isn't as expensive as the first option. Maybe I'm being too sensitive, and that's what's dangerous. Anchoring doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like reasoning, but your mind isn't reasoning it's not as bad as what he did last time. At least this is not as expensive as the first option. Maybe I'm being too sensitive, and that's the danger. Anchoring doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like reasoning, but your judgment was never free. It was just tied to a starting point that another person chose. Is the silent control of anchoring. It doesn't push you towards a decision. It just gives you a compass that always points in the wrong direction. And the more confident you feel about your choice, the more effective the manipulation is, because the best way to direct someone's thoughts is to make them believe they got there on their own. But what if that anchor wasn't just a number or a phrase? What if it was a whole framework, not what is said, but how it is said? Next, we explore the manipulation of the framing effect, how the form of the message becomes more powerful than its meaning. Framing effect manipulation. When the way something is said becomes what you believe. What if the truth could be reframed, not by changing the facts, but by changing the framework around them? What if the same idea could seem safe or dangerous, fair or cruel, depending entirely on how it was presented? This is the subtle influence of framing effect manipulation, a psychological trick in which the meaning of a message is not determined by its content, but by its change of context. Change the wording, change the result. It's not about lying. It's about reframing. And once you understand how easy it is to change perception, you realize how fragile the truth can be. A company says its food is 90% fat-free instead of 10% fat. A politician presents a policy as protecting families instead of increasing surveillance. A manipulator tells you, I'm just being honest, instead of acknowledging that they're being cruel. Each version contains the same information, but the framing creates an emotional tone that guides your response. I'm just being honest instead of acknowledging that he's being cruel. Each version contains the same information, but the framing creates an emotional tone that guides your response. And that emotional tone matters because we make decisions not only with the mind, but also with our instincts. If something feels right to us, we trust it, even if the words have been designed to create that feeling. Manipulators use this constantly. They frame abandonment as giving you space. They rename control as taking care of you. They call pressure motivation. They reframe failure as a learning opportunity, while hiding how they have set a trap for you to fail. And, over time, you stop questioning the content of the message because the packaging is so familiar, so comforting, so persuasive. That is the trick. The truth is not hidden. It is disguised, polished, and presented in a way that makes the lie easier to swallow. Not because it sounds better, but because it feels better. That is why framing is so powerful. It bypasses the facts by reshaping the emotions. And when emotions become the basis of your decisions, you no longer think critically, but respond predictably. The manipulator does not need to argue with you. He just needs to choose the framework that makes resistance seem irrational. But what if they took it a step further? What if they not only shaped what you see, but filtered what you believe? Next, we enter the reinforcement of confirmation bias. How manipulators feed your beliefs to keep you blind to everything else. The reinforcement of the confirmation bias, when your beliefs become your cage. What if someone did not need to lie to you, but only keep showing you what you already believe? What if the trap was not in the deception, but in the comfort in feeding you with the same thoughts, the same opinions, the same truths until you stop looking for anything else? This is the slow suffocation of confirmation bias by reinforcement. In essence, confirmation bias is a natural mental shortcut. Our brain seeks information that confirms what we already believe and filters out everything that questions it. It makes us feel stable, coherent, right? But manipulators know how to turn that instinct into a weapon. They do not need to convince you of anything new. They just flood you with what you already accept until it becomes your whole reality. A political influencer only shares news that supports his side, while silently eliminating or ignoring any other that raises doubts. An algorithm feeds you with content that fits your preferences, gradually reducing your vision of the world to a curated echo chamber. A manipulative leader surrounds you with like-minded followers, reinforcing the idea that dissent is treason. Over time, you stop recognizing the difference between what you believe and what is. They are not lying to you. Simply, they have never shown you anything else, and this is what makes it so dangerous. It feels good. It feels comforting. There is no friction. There is no discomfort. They validate you. They accept you. They support you. But your vision is narrowing. You start to dismiss the contrary facts without reading them. You mock the different points of view without understanding them. You treat the discomfort as proof that someone else is wrong, when it could be a sign that you're missing something important. And in the meantime, the manipulator tightens the noose, gives you more of what you crave. More validation, more echo, until the only voice left in your head is his. That is the trap of the reinforced bias. It does not look like manipulation. It looks like the truth, but a truth that is never questioned is not truth. It is a comforting cloak, and the longer you remain wrapped in it, the harder it is to see the world as it is. But what if they not only shaped what you believe? What if they influenced you below the surface without you realizing it? From conscious beliefs to subconscious nudges. Now we enter the world of subliminal messages, how manipulation hides below the threshold of consciousness. Subliminal messages, when influence hides below consciousness. What if someone could shape your thoughts without ever talking to your conscious mind? What if the real message was not what you hear or see, but what escapes you, planted just below the surface? This is the disturbing power of subliminal messages, a psychological technique in which suggestions are transmitted so subtly, so quickly, or so silently that you do not even realize that they are there, but your brain absorbs them, and more importantly, they continue to affect you. Subliminal messages do not shout. They whisper, They appear for milliseconds in a frame of a movie. They are integrated into the background music. They are hidden in symbols woven into the language, and they are designed to completely bypass your logic, because logic cannot argue with what it does not perceive. In advertising, a single, barely perceptible image can increase your desire for a product. In politics, emotionally charged words are repeated under the voice of a candidate, preparing your brain to associate them with fear or security. In entertainment, suggestive content is superimposed on humor or rhythm, making it memorable without ever feeling conflicting. And although many of these techniques are subtle and controversial, their effect is undeniable. What enters through the side door of your mind does not need your permission, it only needs repetition. Because even when you do not realize something, your subconscious does, reacts, stores it, and prepares your next state of mind, decision, or opinion. And there is the danger. Subliminal messages do not try to convince you. They simply position you, push you towards the desired result, thought by thought, without a single conscious objection, so that when you suddenly feel driven, attracted, moved, you will not know why, you will simply feel it. And that is what makes subliminal influence so powerful. It does not argue, it does not explain, does not wait, it sneaks under the radar and takes roots silently. And when it comes to the surface, you will think the thought is yours. But what if they could go even further? What if, even before you made a decision, they planted the seed that would become your choice? Next, we explore the priming effect, how small signals can shape your actions without you realizing it. The priming effect, when subtle signals shape big decisions. What if someone could guide your behavior not by telling you what to do, but by carefully choosing what you see, hear, or feel before you choose? What if your next decision was not random or rational, but the result of a silent suggestion planted moments before? This is the psychological power of the priming effect, in which exposure to a stimulus subtly influences how you respond to the next. And the most disturbing thing is that you have no idea that it has happened. It does not take much. Show someone words related to age, retirement, gray hair, and wrinkles, and then they will walk more slowly. Show an image of money before a task, and people become more competitive and less generous. Place someone in a room that smells slightly of antiseptic, and they are more likely to clean up what they mess up. They are not coincidences. They are small mental nudges carefully calibrated to direct your mood, your tone, your decision, without you stopping to wonder why. Manipulators use it constantly. A boss prepares a conversation with words like team loyalty and sacrifice before asking you to work overtime without pay. A salesman fills the room with luxury items, polished metal, soft lighting, and elegant music before offering you something expensive. A cult leader prepares his followers with emotional stories of betrayal before identifying an enemy within the group. You think you are acting freely, but in reality, you are reacting to something that has already tipped the scales. And the most disturbing thing is that priming does not change your thoughts, but the conditions in which they arise, so you still feel that you're choosing, but you have never realized the strings that move the puppet. That is the hidden strength of priming. It shapes the starting point of your mind, and when your starting point is chosen by others, it does not matter how carefully you walk, the destination was fixed even before you moved. But what if they not only guided your thoughts? What if they used the words themselves to plunge you even further into confusion, submission, or surrender, while making you believe that you are just having conversation? Next, we enter suggestive language and hypnosis. How words alone can alter perception and bypass resistance. Suggestive language and hypnosis. When words become unseen orders. What if someone could guide your thoughts, change your emotions, and direct your actions without ever telling you what to do? What if carefully chosen and spoken words, in the right way, were all it took to bypass your defenses and get straight to your mind? This is the silent power of suggestive language and hypnosis, not the theatrical kind where someone snaps their fingers and you act like a chicken. It's about something much more subtle and much more real. It's about using language to reduce resistance, bypass critical thinking, and implant suggestions that seem your own. Manipulators who use this technique speak with a rhythm that is relaxing, incorporate orders into soft phrases, insinuate rather than demand. and without realizing it, you follow a manipulative leader. He says you might start to notice how much safer you feel when you agree with the group. A salesperson suggests that most people quickly realize this is the smartest option. The couple murmurs, "It's interesting how calm things get when you stop arguing." None of these are direct orders, but they are messages wrapped in comfort, coded in suggestions, and delivered as a favor. And they work because the mind wants to fill the gaps. We automatically respond to implicit options, subtle cues, and conversational hypnosis, especially when we don't realize it is happening. Certain words like because, imagine, remember, you'll start to notice, open the doors of suggestion, create an internal impulse, and resistance seems unnecessary once inside that narrative. You start to think thoughts that seem spontaneous, make decisions that seem self-directed, but your mind has been guided, not forced, not convinced, just gently directed. That is the power of suggestive language. It sounds like a conversation, but it works like a script, and if the speaker controls the words, the rhythm, the frame, he controls you. But what if suggestion alone was not enough? What if they created a situation where you felt compelled to act, not later, not after thinking about it, but now, before logic even had a chance to catch up? Next, we explore creating a sense of urgency, the pressure cooker that shuts down critical thinking and replaces it with obedience, creating a sense of urgency when pressure replaces thought. What if you made a decision not because it was the right one, but because you feared what might happen if you hesitated? What if someone could completely bypass your reasoning by making you believe that time is running out? This is the high-pressure tactic to create a sense of urgency, a psychological trick in which the manipulator does not argue your logic. He simply does not give it time to express itself. It plays on panic, on scarcity, on the fear of losing something important, because when the clock is ticking, your brain goes into survival mode, and survival doesn't care about nuances, only about acting fast. A salesperson says that this offer is only valid for the next 15 minutes. Then it's over. A manipulative friend tells you that he needs an answer right now, that if you have to think about it, don't bother. The cult leader shouts that the world is about to end, so now is the time to give everything, leave everyone, and follow him without questions. No matter how irrational it sounds, urgency hijacks the moment. And when urgency takes over, doubt is silenced. Your breathing changes, your focus narrows, you don't reflect, you react. This tactic is especially effective in sales, politics, high-control relationships, and online manipulation. They tell you that everyone is doing it, that it is your only opportunity, that if you think about it too much, it is over. And the irony is that you are so afraid of missing something that you don't even realize what you are missing in the decision itself. Because urgency only rushes you, but reduces your options, frames a limited future. Act now, or you will lose everything. And when the fear of loss outweighs the weight of logic, you obey the pressure just to make it stop. That is the power of urgency. It does not manipulate your beliefs, it manipulates your rhythm. And when your mind accelerates, it does not think, it dodges, it reacts, it obeys. The decision seems yours, but it was made under duress. But urgency is just one face of pressure. What if the fear was not of wasting time, but of losing the status of connection or something that everyone else seems to be enjoying? Then we enter the fear of missing out or the exploitation of FOMO, how manipulators use imaginary loss to push you to make decisions you otherwise wouldn't. The fear of missing out or the exploitation of FOMO, when imaginary loss drives real decisions. What if someone could make you say yes, not because you really wanted something, but because you were afraid of regretting saying no? If the fear of missing out was more powerful than the desire to make the right decision. This is the subtle manipulation behind the exploitation of FOMO. It doesn't sell you the product itself. It sells you a vision of yourself, being left behind, excluded, out of the circle. And that vision terrifies the brain because FOMO is primitive, being excluded from the tribe, used to mean danger. So now, when someone implies that others are doing something that you're not doing, or that this offer will not be repeated, it will not return, your mind does not evaluate it, it reacts. A brand launches a limited edition product with a timer, even if the supply is unlimited. A manipulative friend says that we are all going to go without you, but that it doesn't matter, that he already imagined that you would say no. An influencer paints a life full of constant experiences that makes you feel that your quiet reality means that you're being left behind, and you stop thinking critically. You don't ask yourself if you want this, you ask yourself what will happen if you don't. FOMO feeds on imaginary futures. It makes you fear a version of yourself that was not, did not buy, did not join, and that fear does not seem hypothetical. It seems urgent, real, and deeply personal. Manipulators love this because they don't need to prove their worth, they just need to cause discomfort. And once you are in that emotional confusion, you will say yes just to calm the pain of missing out on something. But at the moment the decision is made, that fear disappears because it was never about that. It was about the feeling, and now you are trapped. That is the danger of FOMO. It does not make you want more, it makes you fear less. And when fear becomes the reason for your decisions, you are not chasing joy. You are running away from the void, that void created by another person in order to sell you the cure. What if they didn't start with something big? What if they started with something small, harmless, even useful, just to hook you? Next, we explore the foot in the door technique. How submission begins with a whisper and ends with obedience. The foot in the door technique. When a small agreement leads to a great surrender. What if your willingness to say yes was not manipulated all at once, but step by step, until your limits silently disappeared? What if the biggest manipulations didn't start with pressure, but with a small, reasonable request? This is the stealthy strategy that hides behind the foot-in-the-door technique. It is not about impacting, nor about demanding, but about starting little by little, so subtly that the change is not noticed, and then intensifying once you have said yes. And it works because there's something inherent in human psychology. We want to be coherent once we accept something, especially in public. Subconsciously, we want our future actions to coincide with that agreement, even if the next step is bigger, even if it makes us feel uncomfortable. The seller asks you only for your email, then a few questions, then your time, then your money. The poor man in a relationship asks for a commitment, then another, until you end up living according to his conditions and calling it love. A political movement asks for a simple show of support, then demands actions, loyalty, and silence. When things go too far, each step by itself may seem harmless, even rational, but when they accumulate, they form a ladder that takes you away from where you started. And when you stop to question it, your past agreement is already acting against you. You say to yourself, well, I've already come this far, I don't want to seem incoherent, maybe this is still okay. But each yes is not just a moment, it is a lever. And for the manipulator, it is proof that you're going to continue because they don't need to push much, they just need you to keep walking. That is the danger of this technique. It seems like progress, like you're being helpful, accommodating, or loyal, but little by little you're giving in more than you would have if they had asked you for everything at once. The trick is not in what they take from you, but in how slowly they take it. But what if someone changed the script? What if they started with something outrageous, just so their real demand would seem small in comparison? From a subtle escalation to strategic extremes, we now move on to the door-in-the-face technique. How rejection becomes a trap for surrender. The door-in-the-face technique. When rejection prepares you to say yes. What if saying no didn't close the door, but open it wider? What if your refusal wasn't the end of the manipulation, but the beginning? This is the twisted elegance of the door-in-the-face technique, a persuasion strategy that turns the script around. First ask for something outrageous, and then follow up with what you really wanted from the beginning, and suddenly, that second request seems reasonable, even generous. You think you have negotiated, you think you have stood your ground, but it was never your intention to accept the first offer. It was bait. The trap was the commitment. A manipulative friend asks you to borrow a large sum of money. When you say no, he immediately changes his strategy. Well, can you pay this small bill? A child asks you to stay out all night. You say no, then he asks you until midnight, and you accept, grateful that he has given in. A boss suggests you work both Saturday and Sunday. You refuse, and he says, okay, just Saturday. Then you sigh, relieved, but you still don't have a weekend off. And here what happens beneath the surface is that you are experiencing reciprocal guilt because they have lowered their request and you feel pressured to give in halfway, even though that is still above your limit. The first request softens you, disorients you, and the second comes in a wave of relief, and you say yes, not because it is the right thing to do, but because it is not as bad as the previous one. That comparison is the real tool, not the request itself. And once you have said yes to the second offer, you feel like a reasonable person, as if you had been fair, as if you had won, but you have not won. You have been taken to a destination you never intended to visit, by a path designed to make it seem like it was your idea. That is the trap of the door in the face. It makes surrender look like strength. You think you have drawn a line, but it was exactly where they wanted it to be. Because when rejection is part of the plan, resistance is just one more step towards yes. And sometimes they don't stop there. What if, even after you have accepted, they change the conditions when you have already committed, from false commitments to silent betrayal? We now move on to underestimation, how manipulators close the deal and then rewrite it, underestimating when the real cost comes after you say yes. What if you accepted something that seemed fair to you only to realize that the deal had changed, but you stayed anyway? What if someone offered you exactly what you wanted only to silently rewrite the terms once you had already committed? This is the deceptive tactic of underestimation. It starts with a simple premise. Offer something attractive, easy, or low risk to get a commitment. Then, once the commitment has been secured, the cost is increased. It is a deception with a psychological twist, because they're not deceiving you into accepting something new. They are manipulating you into staying with something worse, because now it is more difficult for you to leave than to stay. A car dealership offers you an excellent price. You accept, and then they realize that the financing has changed and the price is higher, but you have already spent hours there, and you end up giving in. A job promises you flexibility and creative freedom, but once you accept, the micromanagement begins, but now you are trapped. A partner presents himself as patient, understanding, and tolerant, but once an emotional bond is created, expectations change, the rules change, and patience disappears. The low-price strategy works because of the commitment bias, the psychological pressure to remain consistent with what we have already agreed to. Think, I've already come this far. Backing down now would be an exaggeration. Maybe I have misinterpreted the original terms, but that is not the case. The agreement has changed, and now you are controlling the damages and justifying a choice that no longer looks anything like what you accepted. The manipulator counts on your discomfort, on your courtesy, on your hope that things will return to the way they were at the beginning. But that beginning was nothing more than a strategy. It is the silent danger of underestimating something. It doesn't pressure you to say yes, it pressures you to keep saying yes. And when you realize that the cost has increased, you have already built a reason to keep paying it. Not because it is worth it, but because you told yourself that it was worth it. But what if they didn't even need to convince you directly? What if everyone around you is already convinced, and that was enough for you to follow them, moving from changing agreements to changing crowds? Now we enter the manipulation of the bandwagon effect, how the illusion of popularity becomes pressure to conform. The manipulation of the bandwagon effect, when popularity becomes pressure. And what if you didn't believe in something because it made sense, but simply because it seems like everyone else believes it? And what if the fear of being left out was enough to make you just go with the flow? This is the pull of the bandwagon effect manipulation, a tactic that does not win arguments or prove anything. It simply says, join us because everyone else already has. It works because human beings are social creatures. We seek security in numbers, and the more people we see nodding, applauding, agreeing, the more sure we are that we should do the same. Manipulators use this instinct to create momentum, not through facts, but through appearances. A product is labeled as a bestseller even if the sales are manufactured or manipulated. A social movement promotes a hashtag or a catchy and viral slogan, even if the message behind it is empty. In very controlled groups, the leader presents himself as someone universally admired, always citing other vague people who agree with him as been saying how right I am, and when you feel like you're the only one who does not applaud, does not cheer, does not participate, you begin to question yourself. Am I missing something? Am I thinking too much? Why does everyone else seem so sure? And that doubt is all that is needed, because once you feel like the outsider, the cost of nonconformity increases, and joining the crowd seems safer than staying alone. But here is the truth. The crowd may not be real. The agreement may be feigned. All those you think you are following may be nothing more than an illusion created to pressure and silence you. That is the danger of the bandwagon effect. It does not argue, it does not explain, it does not demonstrate. It just moves fast and challenges you not to get on. And in that whirlwind, you stop asking yourself if the direction is the right one. You just run so you don't get left behind. But once inside the crowd, what happens when questions arise? What happens if you still feel insecure, but the only way to find peace is to choose something, anything, just to end the discomfort? Next, we explore how the need for closure is exploited, how discomfort is used to push you to make decisions that you might never have made on your own, exploiting the need for closure when uncertainty becomes a weapon. What if the manipulator did not offer you comfort, clarity, or control, but used your yearning for those things to control you? And what if the real pressure was not what they tell you, but the silence, the confusion, and the loose ends they leave? This is the psychological manipulation of exploiting the need for closure, a tactic that does not try to convince you with certainty, but overwhelms you with uncertainty until any answer seems better than having none. Human beings are programmed to seek resolutions. We want stories to end, questions to have answers, relationships to make sense, and when something is left open, ambiguous, unresolved, confusing, it creates tension. Manipulators use that tension as a weapon. They create confusion and then offer you precisely what you want so much: closure, but is real. Clarity is control disguised as relief. A toxic couple causes emotional chaos and then ends the fight with a tearful explanation that blames you. But at least now the conversation is over. A cult floods new members with an overwhelming doctrine and then offers them a single simple truth to cling to: trust the leader. A demanding boss refuses to give clear instructions and then criticizes the result, and the employee ends up begging for more guidance. In all cases, the manipulator creates disorder and then offers to fix it. And since your brain wants closure more than the truth, you will accept any resolution just to end the psychological noise. The trick is not to make you believe. It is to tire you, confuse you, unsettle you, until certainty becomes more important than accuracy and surrendering becomes more attractive than remaining in tension. That is the power of this manipulation. It hijacks your need for clarity and sells it to you at the cost of your independence. Because when you're uncomfortable for a long time, you will say yes to anything that promises you relief, even if the answer is a lie. But what if they didn't just give a big push, but wore you down with small, constant pressures? And what if each small interaction, each comment, each look was designed to bring you a little closer to surrender? Next, we explore micromanipulation, how control is built through dozens of moments that you barely notice when control comes in small, invisible doses. And what if the manipulation was not obvious? If it did not manifest itself in dramatic speeches, great demands, or open threats, but in quiet and repeated moments that seem too insignificant to fight against? This is the slow erosion of micromanipulation, a technique in which control is never taken all at once, but is built brick by brick through looks, pauses, choice of words, and moments that seem like nothing at all. No act in itself seems like manipulation. Each one could be explained in another way. You wonder if maybe you were thinking too much, that it didn't sound so bad, that it was just a joke, but that is how it works, keeping each interaction just below the threshold of confrontation. The manipulator remains hidden while your confidence is gradually reshaped. They give you compliments that are not quite right. You look very good today. You have finally slept a little. They pause too long when you say something, which makes you doubt your words. They offer you support, but always with a condition. Of course I will help you. It is what I do. I care. I take care of people like you. Nothing is obvious. Nothing by itself would hold up in an argument. But over time, the pattern emerges, and so does the cost. You start to question yourself more. You apologize when you have done nothing wrong. You enter the room, adjusting your mood, and you stop realizing that you are readjusting at all, because micromanipulation does not provoke a reaction in you. It trains you to comply. It makes obedience seem natural, even polite, and it disguises control as subtle social pressure. It can happen in relationships, in workplaces, in groups, or even in individual friendships. It leaves no bruises or ultimatums, only doubts. And those doubts grow until you no longer need to be controlled. You do it yourself. That is the insidious power of micromanipulation. It never feels like a struggle. But in the end, you end up losing not all at once, but little by little, thought by thought, smile by smile, because when control is built in silence, there's no moment to resist, only a gradual surrender. But what if they didn't want you to surrender yet? What if they wanted you to stay restless, unfinished, slightly agitated, so you keep coming back? Next, we explore the Zeigarnik effect. How leaving things incomplete makes your mind crave closure, even from your manipulator. The Zeigarnik effect, when pending matters become a chain. And what if the most powerful way to keep you hooked was not to give you answers, but to never finish the story? And what if your mind kept spinning not because of what they told you, but because of what was not said? This is the subtle psychological control of the Zeigarnik effect, a cognitive phenomenon whereby your brain focuses on incomplete tasks, unresolved emotions, or unfinished conversations much more than on those that are closed. What is open demands your attention, and manipulators use it perfectly. They do not resolve the fight, they do not clarify the confusion, they do not end the conversation, but they walk away, they remain silent, they change the subject, they say now, and suddenly, you are the one who pursues closure. You repeat the last sentence in your head. You write a message that you will never send. You wait, you worry, you wonder. You try to complete the story so you can move on, but you never get that closure because the longer it remains open, the stronger their control becomes. A manipulative partner ends an argument with a believe what you want, and you go into a spiral trying to figure out what that meant. A boss gives you vague criticisms without directions to improve, leaving you anxious and desperate to prove your worth. A cult leader launches a cryptic warning in a sermon without explaining it, but making sure everyone keeps looking for answers in him. The Zeigarnik effect is not about logic, but about a psychological unease, the tension of pending emotional issues that keep you in a loop, not because you want them, but because your mind wants a resolution, and that desire, that mental discomfort is now under their control. Is the silent trap of the Zeigarnik effect. You don't cling to the manipulator for who they are. You cling to the version of the story that your brain has not finished yet. You stay not for love, but to close the chapter, and when they know they will never have to slam the door, they simply leave it ajar. But what if the manipulator didn't leave you looking for closure? What if he had shaped your identity through nothing more than his belief in you, good or bad, and watched how you fulfilled it? Next, we explore the Pygmalion effect, how expectations alone can sculpt behavior. The Pygmalion effect, when expectations become self-fulfilling traps. What if someone didn't have to force you to change because they simply believe you will? What if their expectations, expressed or not, gradually shape the way you see yourself until you become exactly what they assumed you would be? This is the disturbing subtlety of the Pygmalion effect, a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to live up to or fall short of expectations placed on them. When others believe in your potential, you rise. When they expect you to fail, you often do. Manipulators understand this all too well. They don't need to shout or threaten. They just plant the idea that you are always the difficult one. I knew you wouldn't understand. You've never been good with responsibilities, have you? Over time, those phrases are not just judgments. They become mirrors. You start to identify with the roles they assign you, not because they are true, but because they are consistent, because people treat you accordingly, and in the end, you do too. These scenarios may seem similar. A student gets bad results because the teacher expects nothing more from him. An employee stops contributing because his boss constantly ignores him. A partner gradually accepts the blame for all the conflicts because they have labeled you as too emotional or never satisfied. But it also happens in the opposite direction. When a manipulator praises you, but only in a way that serves to control you. He praises you when you are obedient. He tells you how strong, loyal, or selfless you are, but only when those traits benefit him. So you strive to maintain that image. Even if it hurts, you try to be who they say you are, and in doing so, you move further away from who you really are. That is the power of the Pygmalion effect. Expectation becomes architecture. It does not demand change. It only predicts it and then waits patiently. And the more you hear who you are, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before that voice got into your head. But what if they didn't stop there? What if they could turn your failures into victories, reframing your worst moments until you no longer trusted your own sense of reality? Next, we explore the reframing of failure. How even your losses can be used against you with a smile. Restructuring failure when losing is painted as progress. What if every time something went wrong, it wasn't recognized but renamed? What if failure wasn't denied, but reinterpreted so skillfully that you stopped recognizing it as such? This is the deceptive brilliance of restructuring failure, a manipulation tactic in which loss, pain, and mistakes are not corrected, but manipulated not to help you heal, but to make you doubt your judgment and keep you committed to something that doesn't work because you've been told that it is all part of the process. Manipulators don't apologize when they should, but reframe. It wasn't a mistake, it was a learning experience. Now you are stronger thanks to what we have been through. This shows how committed you are. Look how much we have grown, and thus, pain becomes a milestone. Dysfunction becomes a badge of honor. You're no longer allowed to be upset, because look how far you have come. You're discouraged from leaving because why leave after everything you have invested? You begin to believe that all the setbacks, disappointments, and warning signs must have a purpose, that this path, although painful, still leads to some meaningful place, but is not like that. It goes around in circles, and every time you try to name what is really happening, the manipulator offers you a new label, not a lie, but a distortion, enough to blur the boundaries between reality and narrative. And the longer you stay, the more you are praised for your resilience. Your resistance becomes your prison, because now you're not only enduring the difficulties, you are proving something to yourself. Even if that test was planted by another person, that is the trap of reframed failure, which dresses the wounds with wisdom so that you do not treat them as injuries, turns damage into growth, manipulation into transformation, and keeps you chasing validation in a story in which your suffering is the only way to earn it. But what if that story wasn't even about you? What if the manipulator made sure that a single positive trait, a single charming quality, was enough for everyone to forget the rest? Next, we explore the halo effect, how a bright light can blind you and make you see the shadows. The halo effect, when a good trait hides everything else. What if someone didn't need to be kind, honest, or fair, but just seemed charming? What if an impressive quality could blind you and make you miss everything they're doing wrong? This is the silent illusion of the halo effect, a cognitive bias in which our impression of a positive trait leads us to assume that other unrelated traits are also positive. It is not logical, it is instinct, and it is a gift for manipulators because if they seem confident, we assume they are competent. If they are attractive, we assume they are trustworthy. If they speak with authority, we assume they know what they're talking about. And the result is that we ignore the warning signs, downplay the inconsistencies, and rewrite reality to fit the image. A charismatic leader gives powerful speeches, so no one questions the hidden motives behind their policies. A successful businessman is admired for his drive, so his toxic behavior is excused as passion. A manipulative partner is funny, generous, or talented, so when he belittles, lies, or disappears, you forgive him because you have already decided who he is. And the worst thing is that the halo not only distorts your vision of them, but changes your vision of yourself. If someone so good treats you badly, the problem must be you. If others praise him and you feel hurt, maybe you are too sensitive. That is how the trap narrows. You trust the image, not the behavior, and even when his actions contradict the halo, your mind struggles to accept it because it is easier to distort reality than to admit that your judgment could have been wrong. That is the danger of the halo effect. It not only elevates someone, but protects them. And that shield can become bulletproof if you continue to confuse charm with character, confidence with affection, and performance with truth. But what if you had never been given time to see clearly? What if they had rushed your decisions before your logic had time to catch up? From illusions of grandeur to weapons of speed, we now enter time constraints. How can urgency trap you in someone else's timeline, in time constraints, when they rush you to surrender? What if you had never been given time to think clearly because thinking was the only thing your manipulator couldn't afford? What if the pressure you felt was not because of the situation, but because of the clock, which made more noise than your intuition? This is the calculated pressure of time constraints, a manipulation tactic in which urgency is used as a weapon to push you to make decisions before your reason can fully awaken. It's not always about fear. Sometimes it's urgency disguised as opportunity. Sometimes it's disguised as efficiency, decision, impulse. But at heart, it's about stealing the space to reflect. A salesperson tells you that the dealership offer expires today, forcing you to make a hasty decision. A toxic partner demands immediate forgiveness, saying they can't move on unless you forgive them right now. The recruiter pressures you to accept a job before you have time to consider other options. A very controlling group urges you to act by faith because too much thinking leads to doubt. The time limits shut down dialogue. They tell you that if you have to think about it, perhaps you're not prepared, that you are creating difficulties, that you will lose everything if you do not act right now. And that pressure activates your survival instinct. You react instead of reasoning things out. You accept, not because it is the right thing to do, but because silence, hesitation, or reflection seems like a threat to you. This tactic is especially dangerous when combined with other manipulations, a false sense of scarcity, an invented consequence, or an artificial deadline that forces you to act quickly and regret later. And when things fall apart, you will wonder why you did not wait, why you felt so rushed, why you did not listen to that little voice that told you to pause. The answer is simple. You never should have paused. You were destined to comply before the truth had time to come to light. That is the trap of time limitations. They do not give you fewer options. They give you less clarity. And when you feel that time is running out, you accept almost anything so the pressure disappears. But what if that pressure was not just about time? What if they could make a bad option seem good simply by placing it next to something worse? Next, we explore the principle of contrast. How perception is formed not by value, but by comparison. The principle of contrast, when bad seems good next to something worse. What if you said yes to something unfair not because it seemed perfect, but because it seemed better than another option? What if the manipulator did not improve the offer, but simply lowered your expectations first? This is the strategic distortion of the principle of contrast, a manipulation tactic in which our judgment is formed not by what something is, but by what it is compared to. In other words, the same thing can seem horrible or attractive entirely, depending on what comes before. Manipulators use this not to change reality, but to distort your perception of reality. A manager offers you an exhausting workload and then reduces it slightly, making you feel grateful for a schedule that is still unreasonable. A manipulative partner is cold and distant, and suddenly is kind for a day, and in comparison to the silence you're used to, you interpret that as love. A cult demands total obedience, but since it is less harsh than your previous group, you interpret this as freedom. It is a psychological manipulation. You are not evaluating what is fair, but what is better than the previous one. And this creates a dangerous trap. You begin to feel fortunate, relieved, and even loyal to someone who continues to manipulate you, only with more delicacy than before. The principle of contrast is especially effective when combined with time pressure, fatigue, or emotional overload, because when your starting point is misery, even mild mistreatment is perceived as a gift, and soon your standards change. You stop asking yourself what is right or what suits you, and you start asking yourself what is tolerable, and the manipulator maintains control not by giving you something good, but by making sure it is not as bad as the alternative. That is the danger of the principle of contrast. It does not need to convince you that something is good. It only needs to make everything else seem worse. And once you accept pain as your reference, Even crumbs of kindness feel like a feast. But what if they went one step further? What if they could make you overvalue something not because it was rare or useful, but simply because you built it yourself? Next, we explore the IKEA effect, how effort creates attachment, even when it shouldn't. The IKEA effect, when effort becomes attachment. What if the more you worked on something, the more likely you were to believe it was worth keeping, even if it wasn't? What if your investment of time, energy, or emotion prevented you from seeing the truth about what you have built or with whom you have built it? This is the psychological trap of the IKEA effect, named after the furniture brand in which you assemble the product yourself, which leads you to value it more than if it came already assembled. A harmless bias when building shelves, but in the hands of a manipulator, it becomes a powerful way to keep you trapped in something broken. Because when you put in the work, the long conversations, the commitments, the forgiveness, the effort, you don't want to believe that it was in vain. So you convince yourself that it is worth it, that they are all worth it, that the relationship, the work, the group, the cause deserve your loyalty. For how much you have worked to keep it together, a toxic partner watches you while you do all the emotional work and rewards you just enough so that you feel that progress is being made. A manipulative job keeps you overworked and underpaid, but you have created systems, you have trained others, and you're proud of your role. So you tell yourself that you cannot leave now. A controlling group subjects you to endless steps, tasks, and rituals so that when they allow you to enter, your identity is linked to what it has cost you, and the more sacrifice, the more difficult it is to leave, not because things are improving, but because leaving would mean admitting that perhaps it was never worth it. So you stay to justify yourself. You cling to the idea that your effort has created something valuable, even if it has only created exhaustion. That is the silent trap of the IKEA effect. It turns your work into loyalty, and the manipulator does not have to give you anything significant. They just have to let you build it so that you convince yourself that it means something. But what if they could control not only what you build, but also how you choose between what they offer you, even when both options are designed to take you down the same path? Next, we explore the decoy effect, how false options are used to push you toward the decision you have not really made. The decoy effect, when false options take you exactly where they want. What if the choice you have made was not really yours, but was carefully designed to make it seem that way? What if one of your options only existed to make the other seem better? This is the manipulative strategy of the decoy effect, a psychological tactic in which a third inferior option is introduced, not to be chosen, but to direct you towards the decision that the manipulator wants. It is not about freedom of choice, but about the illusion of it. This is how it works. Imagine you must choose between two options. Option A is cheap but basic, and option B is expensive but full of functions. You hesitate, and suddenly, option C appears, with a price slightly lower than that of B, but with many fewer advantages. Now option B seems like an obvious choice. You choose it, not because it is perfect, but because you have been pushed toward it. That is the decoy. It is not there to compete. It is there to compare, and manipulators use it in all kinds of contexts. A manipulative boss gives you two projects, one overwhelming and the other simply demanding. You choose the second, grateful for the easier task. A partner makes two suggestions to you, one obviously unfair and the other subtly selfish. You choose the second one, feeling as if you have yielded. A marketing campaign adds another overrated version of a product that already has two versions to push you toward their preferred option. In the middle, you feel that you have control, you feel intelligent, but your environment has been designed to guide your hand. And the most disturbing thing is how effective it is, even when people are aware of it, because the brain not only wants to choose, it wants to feel that it has made the best decision. And when it is given a bad option to compare, you stop questioning the structure of the game itself. That is the deception of the decoy effect. It gives you the power to decide, while silently manipulating the context around you. Not only do you choose the result that they want, but you thank them for making it so clear. But what if they could go even further, not only shaping your choices, but making your belief in those choices change your actual experience? Next, we explore the placebo effect. How simple expectation can become manipulation, even without a single lie. The placebo effect. when belief becomes its own form of manipulation. What if you didn't need a real solution to feel better, just the belief that something is helping you? What if your mind did the job of healing you, calming you, or giving you confidence, not because of what you have been given, but because of what you have been told to expect? This is the curious and dangerously useful mechanism of the placebo effect, originally observed in medicine. It refers to the phenomenon by which a person experiences a real change after receiving something that has no therapeutic value, simply because they believe it will work. But outside of medicine, manipulators have found ways to turn this effect into a psychological tool. No need to offer a real change. They don't need to fix anything. They just need to give you the appearance of effort wrapped in the promise that things are improving. A toxic partner brings you flowers after a fight, not to change, but so that you believe the dynamic is improving. A boss praises your work just enough so that you keep going, even if nothing structural ever changes. A high-control group offers you a spiritual advance after weeks of confusion and fatigue, restoring your faith in the system they control. None of that is a real resolution, but the expectation of progress reassures you and your brain fills in the rest. You tell yourself that this time is different, that they are trying, that you can feel that things are changing, but nothing has changed except your perception, and as you feel better, you stop wondering why. You stop pressing, you stay. The manipulator does not rely on results. He relies on hope, a hope that your own brain chemistry. And the longer that hope remains, the less you wonder if it has a basis in anything real. That is the trap of the placebo effect in manipulation. It does not require a lie, just belief, and when your mind convinces you that the change is happening, you become easier to appease and more difficult to free. But what if instead of promising gains, they triggered your fear of loss? What if they knew that your mind values what you already have much more than what you could gain and used it against you? Next, we will explore loss aversion, how the fear of letting go can dominate your will to walk away. Loss aversion, when the fear of letting go keeps you trapped. What if the reason you stayed was not because things were going well, but because you were panicked to lose what little you had? What if the manipulator did not offer you more, but simply made you believe that leaving meant losing everything? This is the powerful psychological pull of loss aversion, a well-documented bias by which we feel the pain of loss much more intensely than the joy of gain. In other words, we will do more to avoid losing something than to gain something better. And for manipulators, that is not just psychology, it is influence. They don't need to offer you real happiness. They just need to convince you that leaving means giving something up. You will never find someone who understands you like I do after all this time. You're going to throw everything overboard. You have worked so hard. Don't leave now. They frame your current pain as an investment. They turn the relationship, the work, the belief system into a sunk cost, and suddenly leaving seems like a failure. Even when you are exhausted, even when you know it is not the best thing, you doubt, not because you want to stay, but because you are afraid of what you will lose if you leave. And there's the trick. They don't have to keep giving you anything. They just have to remind you of what you could be giving up, a version of them that once existed, a dream that never came true, a life that you imagined but never really lived. So you stay for the possibility. But what if you cling not to what is, but to what was, or worse still, to what never was? That is the silent control exerted by loss aversion. It does not ask you to believe in the future. It only makes you fear moving away from the past. And in that fear, your freedom becomes the only thing you feel you cannot afford. But what if they went even further? What if they used not only words or pressure, but physical contact itself as a weapon to comfort, blame, or dominate? Next, we explore the power of touch, how even simple contact can be used to manipulate emotions and override resistance. The power of touch, when contact is used to control. What if a hand on your shoulder could silence your doubts? What if a hug, a touch on the arm, or a reassuring pat had less to do with comfort and more to do with control? This is the often overlooked influence of the power of touch, a psychological tool in which physical contact is used not only to connect, but to influence, disarm, and override emotional barriers. At its best, Touch is a gesture of intimacy, support, and trust. It reduces cortisol, increases oxytocin, and helps people feel safer. But in the hands of a manipulator, it becomes a silent language of dominance. They don't shout, they don't argue, they simply place a hand on your back at the right time. They take our hand when we doubt, they hug us when they feel we are moving away, and we feel calmer, safer, not because the situation has changed, but because our body has responded before our mind has had time to process. A manipulative leader uses touch to create a false sense of personal connection with his followers, so that dissent is perceived as betrayal. A toxic couple intensifies a fight and then ends it with a long, tender hug so that your nervous system relaxes, even if the words have never been resolved. A seller gently touches your arm while presenting an offer, increasing the chances that you accept, not logically, but neurologically. The danger is subtle because, unlike words, touch evades skepticism. It is primitive, and if you have been conditioned to associate touch with love or apology, even the hand of an abuser may seem safe. Over time, it becomes a pattern. The worse things get, the more you crave the contact that follows, and the more you equate that contact with comfort, even when it is part of the cycle hurting you. That is the hidden strength of the power of touch. It does not have to say anything to change how you feel, and when feelings override logic, even the most harmful dynamics can begin to seem normal to you. But what if they were not limited to calming you with touch? What if they managed to make you accept things simply by making you speak first? From physical presence to verbal traps. Now we enter the foot in the door effect, how trivial talk can lead to a silent surrender. The foot in the door effect, when trivial talk becomes silent agreement. What if an informal, "How are you?" was not just courtesy, but the first step to getting you to say yes? What if simply answering a simple question made you more likely to comply without realizing why? This is the quiet mechanism behind the foot in the door effect, a psychological trick by which we get someone to engage in seemingly harmless, trivial conversation, making them more likely to accept a subsequent request. It is disarming, charming, and deeply manipulative when used intentionally. It begins with a connection, usually something slight, personal, or socially expected. "Hello. How are you today? What beautiful weather, isn't it? I hope you have a good day." And when you respond, even politely, you have opened the door, lowered your guard, and entered a rhythm of agreement. And now saying yes to the next thing seems easier than breaking that rhythm. A fundraiser chats amiably and then asks for a donation. You feel guilty saying no after being so kind. A manipulative coworker encourages you with jokes and flattery, and then casually asks you to cover their shift. Your partner begins with affection and gentleness before slipping in something selfish, counting on your emotional openness to pave the way, and since you have already accepted the tone, energy, and social flow, rejecting their real request seems harder than it is because the request is unfair, but because you've already said yes to everything else. This tactic works because human beings are deeply social. We not only avoid conflicts, but we avoid breaking the connection. So once you have committed, even the smallest form of connection becomes a lever to open a bigger door. That is the subtle trap of the foot in the door effect. It turns courtesy into permission, and once you have smiled, laughed, or said, "I'm fine," you're no longer responding only to the person you're interacting with, but you're managing the relationship, which makes saying no feel like a violation, even when it is not. You are fine. You are no longer responding to the person. You're managing the relationship, which makes saying no feel like a violation, even when it is the right thing. But what if the manipulation was not based at all on charm or conversation? What if it took advantage of your own sense of ownership, making you overvalue what you already have so that you never let it go? Next, we explore the endowment effect, how your mind turns the familiar into untouchable. The endowment effect, when what is yours seems too valuable to lose. What if the simple fact that something belonged to you made it seem more valuable than it really is? What if the manipulator did not have to convince you to keep something because your brain was already doing it for him? This is a deeply rooted psychological bias known as endowment effect. The tendency of people to value things more simply because they are theirs, not because they are better, more useful, or more meaningful, but because they are ours. It works with objects and ideas, and even with relationships, and it is incredibly easy to exploit. A manipulative partner does not have to treat you well. They just have to remind you how long you have been together. A controlling boss counts on the fact that you have built your career there to prevent you from leaving, even despite the abuse. A sect does not have to offer evidence. It only points out the years, effort, and community that you would lose if you left. The more time, energy, or emotion you have invested, the harder it is to see clearly. You overvalue the relationship, the belief, the position, not because it is the right thing, but because it is yours, and that property blinds you. You begin to defend what hurts you. You justify staying by focusing on everything you would have to give up, without realizing that what you are clinging to is already costing you more than you think. The endowment effect keeps you faithful to pain, to expired dreams, to identities that you have already outgrown, because letting go feels like a loss, although the truth is that you have already lost too much by clinging on. That is the power of the endowment effect. It makes leaving feel like losing, not because what you have is good, but because it is yours, and that illusion of ownership becomes what traps you. But what if the manipulator was not content with keeping you faithful? What if he wanted total control by pushing you beyond bias, beyond belief, directly to your ability to think freely? Next, we enter mind control, how advanced psychological tactics are used to override will, reshape identity, and break resistance. Mind control, when thoughts are no longer yours. What if the decisions you made, the words you said, even the beliefs you had were not really yours? What if someone had slowly overwritten your inner voice with her so subtly that you did not realize it, until you could not distinguish where you ended and where he began? This is the terrifying reality of mind control, not a science fiction fantasy with chips or hypnotic rays, but a real and complex process of psychological conditioning in which manipulators override your will through repetition, isolation, confusion, and emotional dependence. And they do it step by step, never with force, always with familiarity. Mind control is rarely sudden. It is a slow erosion. Your thoughts are questioned, your doubts are reformulated, your support systems are eliminated, and your sense of reality is replaced gently but relentlessly. It is observed in high-control groups, abusive relationships, radicalization pathways, and even in some workplaces. The method is always the same. Break your trust, fill the void, seal the exit. They bombard you with contradictory information until you stop trying to understand. They isolate you physically or emotionally so that their voice is the only one left. They reward obedience, punish dissent, and make all escape routes seem dangerous. Then they give you clarity, their own clarity. Soon you stop asking questions, you stop trusting yourself. You repeat their phrases, you defend their decisions, you believe their version of the truth, even when it contradicts your lived experience. And the most terrifying thing is that you feel calm. You feel safe because that is how it reaches the deepest. True mind control does not feel like domination. It feels like peace, but it is not peace. It is surrender. That is the darkness of mind control. It does not tie your body. It reshapes your reality until the bars are inside your mind, and you thank your captor for keeping you safe. But what if the manipulator always dominated? What if he got what he wants by pretending to be helpless, silly, or naive until you completely let your guard down? Next, we explore the power of playing dumb, how feigned ignorance becomes a tool of silent control. The power of playing dumb, when pretending not to know, puts you in control. What if someone gained power over you not by being smarter or louder, but by acting as if they didn't understand anything, as if they didn't understand anything at all? What if their confusion was real, but a mask designed to deflect responsibility, avoid blame, or control your behavior? This is the deceptive tactic known as the power of playing dumb. It is not about weakness, nor about innocence, but about strategic incompetence, about using the appearance of ignorance as a shield, weapon, or trap. Manipulators who use this tactic know exactly what they are doing. They pretend not to notice, not to mean that, or not to really understand what bothers you so much. And the moment you confront them, they disarm you with a shrug and a lost look. A toxic coworker always forgets deadlines, but never forgets to take credit. A manipulative partner pretends that they have not understood your limits again, and then apologizes without changing. An abuser creates confusion when attention is called to him, turning your anger into guilt. I didn't know it was so important to you. And what happens? You intervene, you explain, you fix, you forgive, you do the emotional work while they stay just below the limit of responsibility. It is especially effective because it seems harmless. They do not shout, they do not pressure, they're just confused. So if you push harder, you seem cruel. If you walk away, you seem impatient. If you get frustrated, they sigh and say you are too intense. And over time, you lower your expectations, you stop asking for more. You do things yourself because it is easier than trying to make someone understand who simply does not understand it. But they understand it. They have always understood it. Playing dumb has never been about what they didn't understand, but about making sure you gave more, asked less, and eventually stopped resisting altogether. That is the silent strength of this manipulation. It allows them to maintain control while you exhaust yourself explaining the rules that they have already learned. And when you realize that the game is rigged, you have spent all your energy trying to teach someone who has never listened to you. But what if they didn't use ignorance to control your present? What if they turned your entire past into a reason why you should stay, even when you knew it was time to move on? Of your ignorance to control your present? What if they had your past in their hands and turned it into a reason for you to stay, even when you know it's time to leave? Next, we enter the sunk cost trap, where the time, energy, and emotions you've already invested become the chains that keep you in place. The sunk cost trap, when what you have given up prevents you from letting it go. What if the reason you stayed was not because things were getting better, but because of how much you have already given to something that does not work? What if the pain you have endured became the reason you convinced yourself to endure more? This is the psychological strangulation of the sunk cost trap, a mental bias in which you feel compelled to continue with something simply because you have already invested time, effort, or emotion in it, even when it is failing, even when it is hurting you, even when it is clearly over. Manipulators thrive in this space. They don't need to offer hope. They don't need to change. They just need to remind you how much you've already given. Are you really going to leave after all we've been through? Don't throw away what we've built. You've sacrificed so much. Don't let it be in vain. But what they're really saying is this: let your past trap you in a future you didn't choose. And it works because human beings are greedy. We hate to waste time, energy, love. So we double down, we give more, we strive more, not because it is the right thing to do, but because we are terrified of admitting that everything could have been a mistake. You tell yourself that the next version will be better. You idealize the early days. You cling to a dream that has become an anchor, believing that if you hold on a little longer, your sacrifice will finally pay off, but all you get is more pain, more confusion, more time that you will never recover. That is the cruelty of the sunk cost trap, which turns your story into a weapon, and the more you struggle to hold on, the harder it becomes to admit that perhaps the bravest thing left is to let it go. But what if the manipulator didn't use your past against you? What if he used his pain instead, offering you glimpses of vulnerability, not to build trust, but to gain power? Next, we explore vulnerability as a weapon. How tears, trauma, and tenderness can become control. Vulnerability as a weapon, when their wounds are used to control you. What if someone's pain was not a request for empathy, but a strategy to keep you quiet, guilty, and submissive? What if the tears you see were not a sign of sincerity, but a shield to protect their power? This is the subtle manipulative tactic of vulnerability as a weapon, in which someone uses their own suffering, their insecurities, or past traumas, not to heal, but to hijack your compassion, to turn your empathy into obedience, to make you feel responsible not only for their feelings, but also for their actions. At first, it is disarming. You see their pain, you soften, they open up just enough to keep you close. I've been through a lot. I'm like this because of what I've lived. I act like this because I'm afraid of losing you. And suddenly, the conversation changes. It is no longer about what they have done to you, but about what has been done to them. You find yourself consoling the person who just hurt you. You pause your limits, you swallow your truth because you are afraid of losing them, and suddenly, the conversation changes. It is no longer about, I am afraid of losing you, and suddenly the conversation changes. It is no longer about what they did to hurt you, but about what hurt them. You find yourself consoling the person who just hurt you. You stop your limits, you swallow your truth because they are crying and you are kind, but there's a price you pay every time you try to defend yourself. Their pain becomes stronger. They do not apologize, they explain, they justify, and you end up feeling like the villain. That doesn't mean their pain isn't real, but pain is no excuse for doing harm. And vulnerability that is only used to evade responsibility is not vulnerability. It is control wrapped in softness. Because when you cannot say no without feeling guilty, you're not in a relationship. You are in a trap. That is the use of vulnerability as a weapon. It uses your empathy as a leash, and the more you care, the tighter it gets, until love means surrendering and limits feel like cruelty. But what if it wasn't just their pain that flooded the moment? What if you were emotionally overwhelmed in such a way that you stopped thinking and simply blocked yourself? Next, we explore emotional flooding, how chaos becomes a smokescreen to control. The emotional flooding, when overload becomes a weapon. What if the volume, speed, and intensity of someone's emotions were not spontaneous, but designed to drown your ability to think? What if they did not win discussions with logic, but by overwhelming your nervous system until the only thing you could do was surrender? This is the destabilizing tactic of emotional flooding. When someone unleashes a wave of intense emotions, not to express how they feel, but to shut you up, silence, or exclude you. It is not about solving anything. It is about controlling through chaos. They escalate their voice, increase their tears, spill their rage, and suddenly, the topic you were trying to address disappears, swallowed by panic, guilt, fear, or exhaustion. You bring up something that hurts you, and they immediately start sobbing uncontrollably. Now you are consoling them. You ask a simple question, and they explode with accusations, screams, door slams. You try to express your needs, but they remain silent and cold, radiating anguish until you back down. No matter what form it takes, what matters is the result. You stop, you become numb, you wonder if it was worth raising the issue, and over time, you learn the pattern. Don't bring up that issue, it will make them explode. Don't express that feeling, it will only provoke a fight. Don't ask for clarity, it will only make things worse. This is how emotional flooding reconfigures your behavior. You start to avoid conflict, not because things are better, but because chaos always wins, and the manipulator does not have to argue or explain anything, just overwhelm. And when you're overwhelmed, you're no longer negotiating, you are surviving. It is the suffocating effect of emotional flooding. It replaces dialogue with intensity and resolution with submission, and the more it happens, the less safe you feel using your voice. But what if they didn't need to scream or cry to keep you confused? What if they created loops, mental traps in which your need for validation always returned to them? Next, we explore the loops of manipulative validation, how doubt becomes the leash that makes you return, the loops of manipulative validation when doubt becomes the leash. What if every time you question something, they make you feel irrational, too sensitive, or simply wrong? What if the only person who could clarify things for you was the same one who made you doubt yourself in the first place? This is the mental labyrinth of manipulative validation loops, a manipulation tactic in which they first make you doubt your reality and then trap you in a cycle of seeking validation from the same person who shattered your trust in the first place. Unlike direct gaslighting, which focuses on distorting your perception, these loops drag you deeper by making you dependent on the manipulator to have a sense of clarity and emotional stability. It is a cycle that they build and that you begin to depend on. It starts subtly. You bring up a feeling, a limit, a memory, and they say that never happened, that you are exaggerating, that you always misrepresent things, so you doubt yourself. You feel anxious, insecure, unbalanced, and in that state of disorientation, you ask them to help you understand it. You need them to reassure you, you need support, but what they give you is not clarity. It is a new version of reality that benefits them. And since you are desperate for peace, you accept it. This is the loop they create. They cause confusion. You seek answers. They become the source of truth, and your dependence grows over time. You stop trusting your instincts. You repeat the conversations in your head. Not being sure of what was real, you think that maybe it was your fault, that maybe you were too emotional, that maybe you should check with them first. And that is exactly what they want, that you no longer trust your memory, your perception, or your feelings, that you trust them. It does not always come with cruelty. Sometimes it is disguised as care. You know I love you. I only worry when you think like that. I'm only telling you because I want to help you see things clearly. But the result is the same. You stop looking for the truth and start looking for approval. And the more you try to feel sane, the more you fall into the confusion they have created. That is the trap of manipulative validation loops. They create the fire and then give you the water, but only enough to keep you dependent and never enough to let you go. But what if they did not limit themselves to distorting your truth? What if they gradually trained you to stop questioning them completely? Next, we explore the creation of learned obedience, how punishment and reward are used to build a silent submission, creating learned obedience when you're trained not to resist. What if they did not manipulate you to obey, but trained you to believe that obedience was your safest option? What if your silence, your caution, your hesitation when speaking were not weakness, but conditioning? This is the effect of creating learned obedience, a long-term manipulation in which your behavior is gradually reshaped through patterns of reward, punishment, and emotional unpredictability. At first, it does not seem like control. It seems that you're learning to keep the peace, to avoid angering them, to survive. It starts with a correction, then a withdrawal, then a punishment that is not named, only delivered in silence, an old blow on the shoulder, a feeling of guilt, a wave of disappointment, and over time, your brain begins to associate resistance with pain. You express your discomfort, and suddenly, they feel hurt or angry. You set a limit, and now they are angry, they blame you, or they make you the bad guy. You challenge them, and they misrepresent it until you end up apologizing. In the end, you stop trying, you stop questioning, you avoid certain topics, you read their mood before each conversation, and the person you used to be, curious, bold, and clear, is replaced by someone who is always scanning, softening, shrinking. They do not need to control you openly, because now you do it for them. They have trained you to back down before speaking, to calculate your tone, to over-explain, to question every instinct that once seemed natural to you. And the scariest thing is that you may not even realize it is happening, because learned obedience is often considered maturity, growth, learning to get along. But in reality, growth, it is containment, it is learned fear. That is the weight of learned obedience. It turns control into routine until you forget what it felt like to say no without preparing for the impact. But what if they did not only train your behavior? What if they even controlled what you have access to? Next, we explore withholding information, how the truth is filtered, delayed, or denied to keep you in ignorance and under control. The withholding of information, when control, is based on what you are not allowed to know. What if you were not confused because you lacked intelligence, but because someone has carefully decided what you are allowed to understand? What if the truth was not completely hidden, but rationed just enough to keep you in your place, never enough to free you? This is the calculated strategy of withholding information, a manipulation tactic in which the flow of knowledge is controlled like a tap that is opened or closed to shape your perception, your decisions, and ultimately, your dependence. It does not seem like a lie. It seems like omission, deviation, or delay. You ask a question, and they tell you that you would not understand it. You raise a concern, and they respond that it is more complicated than you think. You want to know what is really happening, and they tell you to trust them. And at the beginning you do, but little by little a fog begins to form. You notice gaps in the story, contradictions, moments in which your instinct tells you that something is not right, but you do not have facts to support that feeling because they have never given you the facts. Not entirely, not clearly, only enough to keep you in uncertainty, but too insecure to leave. This tactic is especially powerful in environments where control is normalized, in toxic relationships, in very demanding groups, in workplaces governed by hierarchy, where the need to know becomes a wall that keeps you obedient. The more you ask, the more they act as if your questions are the problem. You begin to feel intrusive, paranoid, difficult. So you stop asking, and now they do not even need to hide information from you. You have learned to stop looking for it. That is the silent force of information retention. It does not tell you what to believe. It only reduces your options until you have nothing more than to believe theirs. But what if they did not just limit themselves to hiding information from you? What if they made you feel guilty for wanting to know more, for needing something? Next, we explore manufactured guilt, how shame is created and used as a weapon to keep you small, silent, and stagnant. Manufactured guilt, when shame is built from nothing. What if you felt guilty not for having done something wrong, but because someone made you feel that existing was already too much? What if your needs, your limits, your emotions were presented as burdens until you apologize for the simple fact of being human? This is the emotional trap of manufactured guilt, a manipulation tactic in which shame is not a response to your behavior, but a tool used to control it. You're not really wrong, but they make you feel like you are, and over time, that guilt becomes automatic. You express a need, and they sigh deeply. You try to rest, and they call you selfish. You say no, and they act hurt. I thought you care more. They do not shout. They insinuate. They use the tone, the silence, the opportune moment. They play the victims in a subtle and surgical way, and you begin to shrink, not because they have told you that you are wrong, but because they make you feel that you must be. You apologize for setting a limit, for explaining your feelings. You repeat the conversations in your head, wondering how you could have made things easier for them. And little by little, guilt becomes your reflection. This tactic works especially well with kind and empathetic people, because you want to be good, you want to do the right thing, and they turn it into a leash. Even your healing becomes selfish. Even your silence becomes cruel. Even your absence becomes a betrayal. And the more guilt you carry, the more they control you, because someone who drowns in shame is too tired to rebel, too insecure to resist, too scared to believe that they deserve something better. That is the power of manufactured guilt. It turns decency into obedience, and the more it sinks in, the more you punish yourself so that they do not have to. But what if guilt was not used alone? What if each favor, each compliment, each kind gesture came with an invisible label with a price? Next, we explore toxic reciprocity, how manipulators keep track and use your own gratitude to make you obey. Toxic reciprocity, when kindness becomes currency. What if each favor was a transaction, each compliment an initial payment, each generous act just another entry on an invisible and growing scorecard, one for which you did not know you were being judged until it was too late? This is the silent debt of toxic reciprocity, a manipulation tactic in which acts of kindness are not given out of affection, but as influence. It looks like generosity, it sounds like love, but behind the smile there is an accounting book, and everything they give returns with interest. They invite you to dinner, and then they tell you, "After everything I have done for you, is this how you treat me?" They help you move, and weeks later, they make you feel guilty so that you do something uncomfortable because friends help each other. They shower you with praise or gifts at the beginning of the relationship, only to use that love as an excuse so that they do not allow you to leave. You feel trapped, not by cruelty, but by obligation, by a voice that tells you that you owe it to me, that you're not ungrateful, that people would kill to have what I have given you. But the gifts were not free. The affection was not unconditional. It was currency waiting to be collected. And if you hesitate to return it with time, with energy, with silence, they make you feel selfish, disloyal, that you do not deserve anything. This type of manipulation is insidious because it hides behind virtue. It looks like generosity. It plays the long game, and when the time comes to pay the debt, you can no longer distinguish between kindness and control. You stay not because you want to, but because they have made you feel that leaving would be stealing. That is the trap of toxic reciprocity. It uses good deeds as a weapon to tie you with guilt, and when you realize that they're charging you for a favor, you have already stopped saying no. But what if they did not even have to say anything? What if they could control the situation completely without saying anything, without doing anything, and forcing you to live in the silence they have created? Next, we explore silence as a weapon. How silence becomes punishment and absence becomes a tool of domination. Silence becomes a weapon when it becomes a cage. What if the loudest form of control did not involve shouting, but absolute and calculated silence? What if someone could dominate a relationship not by speaking, but by disappearing, withdrawing, or simply refusing to answer until you broke first? This is the chilling tactic of silence as a weapon, a form of emotional manipulation in which silence is not peace, it is punishment, it is not absence, it is control, and it is designed to make you feel anxious, ashamed, and eager to please. At first, it seems that someone just needs space, but then they disappear in the middle of a conversation. They ghost you after you express a limit. They become cold and distant, not to reflect, but to punish you. You send them text messages, you apologize, you question yourself, you enter a spiral wondering what you did wrong. And when they finally respond, it is never with clarity, but with more ambiguity, a vague response, a passive-aggressive sigh, a disdainful, "I've been busy," and you breathe a little easier, not because the problem has been solved, but because the silence has ended. You have been trained to yearn for the sound of their voice, even if that voice is unfair, manipulative, or cold. With the "I've been busy," and you breathe a little easier, not because the problem has been solved, but because the silence has ended. You have been trained to yearn for the sound of their voice, even if that voice is unfair, manipulative, or cold. Over time, you learn the rules, you avoid topics that may provoke rejection, you tiptoe around honesty, you shrink to adapt to their silence, because their silence hurts more than anything they can say, and it is precisely why it works, because you no longer engage for connection, you engage to avoid exile. That is the power of silence as a weapon. It does not raise its voice to dominate. It simply disappears long enough for you to despair for it to return, and in that despair, you begin to give away pieces of yourself just to hear them speak again. But what if silence was not enough? What if they needed to do more than erase your voice? And what if they wanted to erase your identity, piece by piece? Next, we explore the fragmentation of identity. How destroying you becomes the first step to building someone they can control. Fragmentation of identity, when they break you little by little until you become someone you're not. And what if the person in the mirror started to seem strange to you? Not because you have changed on your own, but because someone else is rewriting who you are bit by bit. And what if they did not take away your identity all at once, but dismantled it gradually until you no longer trusted your instincts, your values, or your voice? This is the deeply invasive tactic of identity fragmentation, a form of manipulation in which your sense of self is slowly broken down, reshaped, and replaced to better suit them. At first, you don't realize what is happening because it doesn't start with destruction, but with suggestions. They start by questioning small things. Why do you always react like that? It's not your style, is it? You don't like those things anymore, do you? It sounds casual, but those comments begin to undermine you. Your hobbies, your beliefs, your limits. Everything becomes susceptible to criticism until you start questioning who you are. Then comes the remodeling. They praise you when you're compliant. They reward you when you do what they want. They define you in ways that flatter you at first. You are not like the others. You have understood it. You are much calmer now. I have helped you grow, and you begin to adapt. You change the way you speak. You adjust your opinions. You dress differently. You think differently. You act differently, not out of freedom, but out of survival. The more fragmented you are, the easier it is for them to fill in the gaps. Plant new definitions to build someone more pleasant, less challenging, more useful. And if you ever resist, they will remind you how far you have come, how much better you are now, how much of a disaster you were before. So you remain fragmented because questioning the new identity means facing the terrifying thought that you have been rewritten. That is the slow devastation of identity fragmentation. It does not erase you overnight. It breaks you into pieces and returns only those that serve them, until one day you wake up wondering what has happened to you. But what if that new version of you came with rewards? And what if they convinced you that you are strong, capable, and empowered, as long as you stay within the limits that have been set for you? Next, we explore false empowerment. how praise becomes a leash disguised as wings. False empowerment. When praise becomes a leash disguised as wings. And what if someone made you feel powerful, but only in the way that allows them to keep you under control? And what if they built you with compliments, encouragement, and confidence, but only as long as you do not cross the limits that have been silently set for you? This is the illusion of false empowerment, a manipulation tactic in which you are told that you are free, capable, or they trust you, but only within the limits that benefit the manipulator. It doesn't look like control. At first, it looks like support. They tell you things like, I know you can do this. You are very strong. You're not like the others. I can count on you. You have matured a lot since you have been with me. And you believe them. You feel seen, valued. They trust you to take the reins, to lead, to progress, but only in the direction they approve. Take a step further. Ask too many questions. Change in ways they haven't authorized, and suddenly their tone changes. You are too much. You are becoming arrogant. You are moving away from what really matters. The same traits they praised, your independence, your confidence, your voice, are now presented as threats, and suddenly empowerment vanishes because it was never real. It was a permission disguised as praise. False empowerment is not about building you up. It is about making you believe that they're the reason you have grown, so that if you ever try to leave, you will wonder if you can still be so strong without them. You end up doubting your strength, even if you seem empowered, because the freedom they gave you was conditional. It came with tacit conditions and a clear warning. You can be whatever you want as long as it doesn't threaten their control. That is the trap of false empowerment. They flatter you until they lock you in a cage, and when you realize that your wings have been cut off, you're already afraid to fly alone. But what if the manipulation was not hidden behind flattery or praise? And what if it was disguised as compassion, false empathy, feigned tears, and choreographed concern, enough to keep you close? Next, we explore performative empathy, how pretending to care becomes the ultimate emotional camouflage. Performative empathy, when affection is just another disguise. And what if someone could say all the right words, show all the right emotions, and seem to care without feeling anything at all? And what if empathy was not a connection, but an act? This is the silent deception of performative empathy, a manipulation tactic in which the appearance of affection is used to disarm, control, and silence without ever offering true understanding. It seems warm, it sounds sincere, but it is scripted. They know when to nod, when to whisper, "I'm here for you," when to shed a tear at the right moment. They listen with tender eyes, but only when it suits them, only when it benefits their image, only when worrying is the most effective way to keep you in your place. After hurting you, they say, "I feel so bad about what I've done," and then divert attention to their pain in public. They speak eloquently about kindness and compassion, while in private, they ignore or invalidate your difficulties when you are your limit. They offer you comfort, not to support you, but to restore the emotional balance just enough to prevent you from leaving. That is empathy as a tool, a focus of attention, a calculated act to maintain the illusion that they're the good ones, the understanding ones, even the victims. And even when you try to call it that, when something doesn't add up, they give it back to you. Are you saying that I don't care, that you don't believe me after everything I have done to support you? Now you're the one who seems ruthless. Now you're the one who is questioning your judgment again because they were so kind, weren't they? But empathy without responsibility is manipulation, and kindness used to control you is not kindness at all. It is the mask of performative empathy, which give you just enough softness to keep you quiet, just enough warmth to make you doubt your coldness, and just enough presence to excuse their absence. And when caring becomes theater, you're always playing the role of someone who owes them another opportunity. But what if they didn't act like they were kind? And what if they acted like they were better, morally superior, spiritually evolved, irreproachable, and used that righteousness to keep you below them? Next, we explore the abuse of moral superiority, how superiority becomes a weapon disguised as virtue, the abuse of moral superiority, when righteousness becomes a weapon. And what if every disagreement was not just a difference of opinion, but proof that you are less evolved, less kind, less worthy? And what if the person you challenged not only thought they were right, but believed they were better? This is the isolating tactic of abuse of moral superiority, a manipulation in which someone uses their supposed ethical values or superior principles to silence dissent, dismiss your feelings, or even make you look guilty simply for questioning them. They don't dominate with volume. They dominate with virtue. I'm just trying to do what's right. If you can't see it, maybe you aren't where I am yet. I would never behave in that way. I guess we just have different views. Some of us care more for integrity than being liked. It sounds noble, above the drama, but it leaves you in a silent corner feeling petty, reactive, or small. Because how do you argue with someone who has positioned themselves as morally superior? You can't. Every time you speak, they suggest that your tone is inappropriate, that your motives are suspicious, that your emotional response proves that they're the calm and reasonable ones, and you are the unstable and problematic one. This tactic is especially brutal in spiritual communities, activist circles, or any relationship based on shared values. They co-opt language intended for growth and healing and turn it into a shield. You're being negative, that's not very enlightened. I'm just trying to hold the space. You're being confrontational, but what's really happening is a rejection, not of your ideas, but of your character. I'm just trying to hold the space. You're being confrontational, but what's really happening is a rejection, not of your ideas, but of your character. They frame your disagreement as a flaw and their dominance as virtue, and suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what is true, but about who is better. That is the control and the abuse of moral superiority. It makes you question your goodness just for expressing yourself. And if you're not careful, you'll start to think that silence is integrity, when in reality, it's submission. But what if they didn't even wait for conflict to begin? What if they made themselves the victims first, changing the script before you had a chance to speak? Next, we explore preventive victimization, how manipulators shout, foul. Before you can shout, preventive victimization when they shout first to keep you silent. What if every time they hurt you, the person who caused it made themselves the victim before you could say a word? What if they beat you in pain, not because they were suffering, but because it gave them an advantage? This is the manipulative twist of preventive victimization, a tactic in which someone first adopts the role of injured party, framing your reaction as an attack before you have the opportunity to express what has really happened. It's not just a diversion, it's a defense by investment. You're about to bring up something that hurts you, but before you can, they sigh, "I can't believe you're mad at me. Do you know how hard this week has been for me? I already feel terrible about everything. Why do you blame me more? You always make me look like the bad guy. I never do anything right with you." And suddenly, you're no longer the one seeking accountability. You are the aggressor. You are the insensitive one. You're the reason why they are suffering again. It's brilliant in a cruel sense because it restructures the whole dynamic. They cry first, it collapses first, and the focus of attention shifts to them. Even when you're the one bleeding, you end up consoling the person who hurt you. You keep the truth to yourself to protect their feelings. You walk away from the conversation with more guilt than relief. Over time, you stop saying what you think because you already know how it ends, them trembling and you apologizing again. This tactic is especially toxic when you have been hurt in a subtle way, difficult to name, easy to downplay, or linked to past patterns. Because the more invisible the damage, the easier it is for them to paint you as the one who threw the first punch. That is the trap of victimhood. It steals your voice by making you feel cruel for using it. And once someone makes you believe that your pain is an attack, you stop defending yourself and start offending them. But what if they weren't based on lies or logic at all? What if they just kept you in uncertainty, kind one day and cold the next, until you couldn't tell which was the real version? Next, we explore strategic inconsistency, how unpredictability becomes addiction and confusion becomes control. Strategic inconsistency, when unpredictability becomes a cage. What if the person you trusted most changed like the weather, sunny one day and stormy the next? What if what kept you hooked was never knowing which version of them you were going to find? This is the disorienting power of strategic inconsistency, a manipulation tactic in which unpredictability becomes the control mechanism, not through rules, but through the emotional roulette, not through routine, but through chaos wrapped in charm. One moment they are affectionate, present, playful, and the next moment they're distant, cold, dismissive, and then they come back without warning, and you get caught in the whiplash and start chasing the good times, even if they're crumbs, thinking that maybe you said something wrong, that maybe if you were more patient they will come back, that maybe your job is to keep the peace, but none of that has to do with you. It's about controlling through instability, because predictable people allow you to breathe, but strategically inconsistent people make you hold your breath, waiting to see what they will be like today. They attack you and then shower you with tenderness. They ignore you and then act like nothing happened. They hurt you and then they become so sweet that they make you question your own memory. And that contrast, the intensity of the bad followed by the avalanche of the good, addictive like a gambler waiting to win, like a child trying to earn a smile, like a prisoner waiting for the guard to be in a good mood today. You stop looking for balance. You stop demanding clarity. You just wait for a good version of them, and you blame yourself when you don't get it. And that's the trap. They don't have to close the door. They just make you too dizzy to find the exit. That is the lasting grip of strategic inconsistency, turns inconsistency into intimacy. And when you realize it, you've been trained to crave chaos. You have forgotten what it feels like to be safe. And remember that the sharpest minds are those that refuse to be shaped without consent. If you have recognized yourself in these tactics, not only in others, but also in moments of your own life, that is not weakness, it is awareness, and awareness is the beginning of freedom. If this has resonated with you, feel free to share what has caught your attention the most in the comments, not only for me, but for the next person who reads it and needs to know that they are not alone. And if you want to continue exploring the darkest corners of human psychology, subscribing will help you stay informed. Giving I like allows this message to reach other people who may need it, and each voice that joins next keeps the conversation alive. Until next time, stay alert, stay awake.